All right, good morning, everybody. We are going to get going here. Okay, can everybody hear that or see that okay on Zoom? Give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Thank you very much, Bill. All righty. Move you guys up to the corner so I can see my own slides. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Amanda Tracy. I'm one of the 4 vegetable crop specialists that works for OMAFRA, and I cover tomatoes, peppers, sugar beets, table beets, eggplants, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to be doing some just introduction to the industry, and then we'll go over some disorders, and then we'll pass it off. So this is a general breakdown of what we're going to be looking at today. So we are going to have a break after Cheryl covers diseases, and then we'll move on. So Anne is actually not going to be able to join us in person today, but she is going to come over the Zoom meeting and give her presentation through Zoom. So we might have to get nice and close and cuddly in person here so we can watch her on the Zoom account. But she does apologize that she's not able to make it in person. She's a bit under the weather right now, but she is going to remind me to change the slides in person because you're not looking at the same thing I'm looking at on my computer. All right, we'll get this figured out. It's okay. There. Now I feel like I'm in like a box. Okay. Okay, for all my people on Zoom, it all happened at one time. It's okay. All right, so all our Zoom people, please make sure that you are on muted. You can put your video on if you want to. That depends on your bandwidth. I don't care. I can't see you anyways because I'm screen sharing. So that's up to you. I will look at the chat feature between presentations. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat feature there, or we can, or you guys gotta remind me, someone give me a cue when I forget to change the slide, okay? Thanks. You can put them in the chat feature or at the end of the presentation, just unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, so this workshop, I know there's some people on here that are from greenhouse and they're hoping there's going to be some transference, but I just want to reiterate that this is a workshop that is going to be focusing on field grown tomatoes and peppers. If you do want to try and transfer some of that over to the greenhouse side of things, that's fine, but not all of the issues are going to be the same in greenhouse as they are in the field. So just keep that in mind as we go through this, if you are one of the people looking at the greenhouse side of things. Okay, this is our general schedule for today. Don't mind that 000 on the 12 p.m. Not really sure what happened, but let's move on. Here are some of the faces that you're going to be seeing today. There's my beautiful mug. There's also Cheryl, who is sitting at the back of the class here, and the Zoom people will get to see her very shortly. And then we'll also be having Darren Robinson come on to talk about weeds, and Verholland, she's going to come and talk about soil sampling and structures. And then we have Tajendra Chapagan, and he's going to be coming in and talking about tissue sampling and nutrient deficiencies and that kind of thing. Alrighty. Okay, so let's get into some background of the industry. So what I always like to start off with is this slide to just give you an understanding of where these crops kind of fit in the value they represent to Ontario, right? So these are the top 10 vegetable crops for farm gate value in Ontario right now. So as you can see, tomatoes is the number 2 for farm gate value, which means like the value of the crop for the growers in Ontario right now, and peppers is number 4. So these are pretty high value crops that you're going to be working with, right? So that's why people are investing in them, and they're having people like you come out to scout them because this represents quite a bit of income potential for them. I'd also like to note that 2 years ago, peppers was actually down the list a couple, closer to where like onions and cabbage are right now. So that the value of peppers has actually increased quite a bit over the last few years. And I would expect that to keep happening, especially given some of the disease issues and stuff we've been having in the past couple of years, which I'm sure Cheryl will get at. It's harder to get good quality field peppers when you're having a lot of disease and insect issues, right? So I talk really fast also. So I apologize. You can give me the thumbs down if you need me to slow down. Okay. Okay, so let's go into field grown tomatoes and peppers. What's the difference? There's a lot of varietal differences and tolerances, right? So for processing tomatoes, last year, there was over 12,000 acres of processing tomatoes and almost 2,000 acres of fresh market tomatoes. So they have different end uses, right? So processing tomatoes, they're going to be going to the plant, right? So you're going to be used in paste, maybe some whole peel, juice, or diced. Whereas the fresh market tomatoes, right? We're selling that as a whole tomato. And those need to be blemish free, nice uniform and bright color. Whereas on the processing side, we might have a little bit more flexibility with the color and any blemishes on the skin, right? Because they're going to be processed. There's also some differences in the way that fresh market and processing tomatoes are harvested. So processing tomatoes, they're a once over machine harvest. They go through, it's crop destruct, and they take the tomatoes and they go in one big load or multiple big loads to the processing plant. Whereas fresh market tomatoes, that's multiple hand harvested. They're handled more gently. They're picked as they ripen on the vine, right? So there's a lot of differences between the two structures. And then again, with the transport, we're looking at bulk transport for processing tomatoes, whereas the fresh market tomatoes are put into smaller bins or flats to be put to the grocery store or wherever they're going. Okay, for field grown peppers, so this acreage has actually increased quite a bit over especially the last 10 years. So we're at over 4,000 acres of tomato or peppers, grown for processing primarily, but there is some fresh market peppers as well. These are hand harvested. So because even processing peppers, they'll have multiple harvests, usually 2, but on a really good year, 3, which is a bonus for the growers. So we haven't come up with a way to be able to do like a really good pick of peppers without using people, because we have these multiple harvests, right? So hand harvest for processing peppers is 2 to 3, and then for fresh market peppers can be more depending on the variety of pepper and the grower and their market and whatnot. There is somebody out there that I haven't been able to see yet trying out an automatic harvester for peppers that's supposed to obviously not destroy the crop. I haven't heard, and this is supposed to be the first year, so I'll let you know if you come back next year. I'll let you know if I got to see it and how it went. They're just trying it out on obviously a small acreage, but it'll be interesting to see how that goes. So some more differences between the two types of growing systems. So fresh market, your tomatoes, your transplants are a lot larger. They're generally grown on plastic, as you can see there, and they're usually staked, so they're up off the ground. And they're transplanted a little differently too, because they're usually grown in single rows. Processing tomatoes, on the other hand, you're looking at a much smaller transplant. So you generally want them to be around 4 inches for the transplanters. They're grown generally in twin rows and not on plastic, not staked, pretty minimal inputs on that side of things. Both can be irrigated. So I would say about just over half of the processing tomatoes are irrigated. And then all of the fresh market tomatoes that I am aware of are irrigated, primarily through drip irrigation. And then you can see the carousel transplanter on the bottom right there for tomatoes. That is the traditional transplanter, and there are still a lot of people that use that, but there is now the movement towards automatic transplanters. And I'll show you this video here that I was able to get of the automatic transplanters. So this is gonna be tricky to try and get these to both start at the same time. And I don't know if I'll be able to do it. Okay, so here you can see the needles. So the plant, they place them on a belt, and then you can see the transplants move up the belt and then go down through the belt, down vertical, and they're put down into the trench. See the plants there going through the transplanter. So they are actually able to plant at a faster speed with these automatic transplanters, and they're using just a fraction of the manpower to be able to do that too. So I just wanted to show you that that's one of the innovations that's been going forward. There's a lot more of these transplanters out there. This one in particular was the AgriPlanter, but there are other versions from other companies out there. This one seems to be the most popular. Anyways, just in case you see that when you're out and about this season. Okay. Again, end uses for the tomatoes are different. Fresh market tomatoes are put into baskets. They're handled very gently, and then they're put into flats. Processing tomatoes, they're destroyed, put into a truck or a tractor and trailer, and shipped off to make paste or juice or whatever. Okay. Peppers, very similar differences between fresh market and processing. Fresh market has larger transplants. They're put on plastic and they're hand harvested, but we already know that. And then the processing peppers, they're a lot smaller. They're usually planted in twin rows. There are some people that do single rows, but it's primarily twin rows. And they are oftentimes irrigated, but there are some people that don't irrigate their processing peppers. No plastic, so again, lower inputs in the processing peppers because they're not worth as much, right? Okay, so it's really important. Sorry, I know I'm going through this fast. So it's really important to know what you're scouting. So plant varieties, what's the end product? That's gonna make a little bit of a difference for you in what you're looking for, and even the leeway that you're giving a certain disease or a pest issue. But the end goal for today is just that you'll get to know the common pest issues. Hopefully you'll be able to recognize what a problem looks like versus something that maybe isn't an issue. And even if you aren't able to identify it directly, you'll know it's an issue and you'll be able to do some more research until you can figure out what it is, because there are a lot of things that look very similar, and you'll see that as we go through it today. Ignore that. The introduction to IPM workshop was yesterday, and there's a recording somewhere on the YouTube channel, I believe, if you're interested in that. Okay, so let's go into some scouting basics in case you did not make it to the session yesterday. I believe it was virtual. Did anybody make it to that session yesterday? Yeah, a few? Okay. So overview for those that didn't. For scouting, you want to walk a random path through the field. Make sure you're stopping regularly to check the plants or any problem areas that you had from a previous week or from a previous season even. Check any pest traps that you have, or even some, now we do spore trapping, so you might have something in there for disease. So check any traps that are in the field. Make sure you're recording the numbers that are on the trap ID, the date, all that kind of stuff. And then try to diagnose your problem, or at least record the problem so you can have someone else help you diagnose it. Make sure you're taking really good notes. Take lots of pictures using a variety of angles. I'll go over that a little bit more. Your cell phones nowadays, like the cameras on them are actually really, really good. So you can take excellent pictures just by having your phone in your pocket. You don't have to have any specialized tools for this anymore. And then take some samples, whether you need to take a whole plant or a couple leaflets or some fruit, take some samples and bring them back so you can get help if you need to for identifying them. Okay, some tools. Okay, this is a really big list of tools, and ideally your scouting kit would have all of these, but 90% of it's going to stay in your car. And the things that you really want to make sure that you're carrying with you are your smartphone, a knife and a hand lens, maybe a plastic bag and a marker. I like to have a trowel, but I usually keep that in the car. If you are taking samples and you know you're taking samples, have a cooler waiting for you to put them in, some hand sanitizer. And that's not just for you. Sometimes that's for putting an insect specimen in. Instead of using alcohol, you can use a gel hand sanitizer to help you preserve that specimen. Or it could be cleaning your tools between taking different plant samples. And then have some jars or vials around. So those are the red ones, are like the bare minimum that you should be keeping in your vehicle when you're going out to scout. Okay, so I'm going to go into now why it's so important to take good pictures. So if you look at these pictures, essentially they're the exact same picture. They're the same view, they're the same angle, it's the same lighting, but the focus is different. So make sure you're focusing on what you actually want the person to look at. So if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see a plant that's not looking so well, right? So that picture tells you a very different story from the picture on the right, which shows you a very healthy tomato transplant. So just make sure that whatever your target is or whatever the problem is, you're focusing on the right thing. Another thing with pictures is it's a variety of getting a variety of angles is a good idea, and making sure you have good lighting. These are actually terrible pictures that I myself took, but because I took a variety of pictures and variety of angles on the same insect pest, I'm able to identify that this is actually a brown marmorated stink bug nymph. Okay, so even if your lighting's poopy or it's raining and it's just terrible out, just take a ton of pictures. The more the better, and we can help you guys figure out what's going on. Okay, so that's the intro. Are there any questions? Perfect. Let me check the chat. Good morning. That's fine. That has nothing. That's not a question. Okay. Okay, we're going to be moving on now to disorders. This is going to be so much fun. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing this one too. Nope, 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 nope. Okay. I had it all open and then for some reason I closed it and now I was so organized before everything happened and then it threw me right off. Okay. Alrighty. Disorders. Seriously? Seriously, life, you're going to do that to me right now? Don't do that. Just open the presentation. Okay, let's get this up and going for a Zoom. This is also going to be cut out of the recording. I don't want to do that. Thank you. Okay. Bill, can you see that? I'm gonna guess you can. All right. Moving on to tomato and pepper disorders. So some resources that you guys can look at if you are confused or you're in the field or whatever. Go on Ontario Crop IPM. There's a number of disorders there. It also covers diseases and insect pests as well. So if you're having some trouble IDing stuff, this is a really good resource. Another resource on vegetables.com. It's a blog. You can subscribe to get any of the updates. And we do post a lot of what's going on around Ontario on here. We also do weekly vegetable crop reports that get posted on here. So you can get an idea of what's going on in a variety of different crops as well. Okay, but Ontario Crop IPM is a really good resource. For now, we are moving this to a larger database, web-based database, but that's not happening this season. So you should be good to go here. Okay, subscribe. Yep. Okay, so what's a disorder? So a disorder is actually a physiological abnormality in the plant that's caused by abiotic factors. So this isn't a pest, right? This is something that's caused by a non-living factor like weather or nutrient availability. So let's start off with some weather-related disorders like frost, wind or sandblasting, hail, lightning. Frost, let's hope you're not seeing that. I tend to see it more in the fall, not so much on transplants, but it does happen. So this happens in tomatoes when it's below -1, -2, and peppers are a little bit more sensitive. If you get down to 0, you're even close to 0, you'll see some frost injury on peppers. That's why peppers tend to be transplanted a little bit later than tomatoes. So the symptoms here, you're going to see the whole plant being affected, and usually it'll be more widespread across the field, right? So it could be patchy. It just depends on your topography of the field, but generally you'll see it to be a little bit more widespread. So this is chilling damage, not frost damage. So this is a little bit different. So for temperatures below 10, air temperatures, or below 15 soil temperatures, generally the whole plant's affected, and the symptoms again will be pretty uniform across the field. You'll know the difference just if you look back in the weather and see what the temperatures were the night before. You'll be able to tell if it's chilling or frost. If it's frost, you're not likely to come back from that. Chilling, it depends on the severity of the chilling, with the plant's going to be able to recover from that. Sandblasting, so this tends to happen when there's high winds and on lighter ground. So I do see this quite often. It happens more with the processing tomatoes because they're a smaller transplant and they have no plastic cover, right? So you'll see that the whole plant is affected. If you look back at the weather again, you'll probably be able to figure out that there was high winds, and it'll be relatively uniform across the field, and you'll see a lot of damage and even some ripping to the leaves and the stem. Okay, I know I'm going through this really fast. I'm not giving as much detail as I normally would. But if you have any questions about any of these, please let me know. Okay, hail injury. This one can be quite obvious, but it's often confused with insect and disease damage as well, especially if you look at the bottom right-hand picture there. You see the damage on the stem. That could be easily confused with, like, if it was a rodent or something like that that you had in the field, which does happen. So you'll see ragged holes, usually on larger plants. You'll see it on the top of the foliage, but on smaller plants, it could be damaging the whole thing. If you have fruit, you'll see depressed areas on the fruit and bruising. And in severe cases, it'll shred the plant, right? Okay, lightning injury doesn't happen as often as you'd think it would. So what you're gonna see is a very circular area affected in the field, and it's usually anywhere from 3 to 20 meters in diameter, depending on the lightning strike. So what you'll see is that the leaves at the ends of the branches will start to droop off, and then the plant will begin to wilt, and it could eventually die, depending on where it is in that pattern. If you cut the stem lengthwise, a lot of the times you'll see a hollow stem, or even this laddering effect that you can see in that top left picture there, that laddering effect on the inside of the stem. Okay, so recognizing other disorders on leaves and fruit. So these are going to be some common things that you'll see throughout the season. Leaf roll, this happens in tomatoes. This happens usually when it's hot and dry growing conditions, or really waterlogged soils and you're getting root injury. Certain cultivars will be more susceptible to this than others. So you might see it, and then depending on what cultivar you're in, you might not see it in another one that's a few rows over. The edges of the leaves roll up. There is an insect called a leaf roller. So just open that up, make sure there's not a leaf roller in there, and that it is actually this leaf roll and not the insect leaf roller. And then the leaves might actually develop a tough or leathery texture. And so this is a response to weather conditions, and there's really nothing you as a scout can do about it. Blossom drop. So in peppers particularly, you will always get some degree of blossom drop because they always produce more flowers than they're able to sustain as fruit. So a little bit of blossom drop in peppers, completely normal. But if you're seeing excessive pepper drop or blossom drop in peppers, then there's something going on. And in tomatoes and peppers, it's a stress condition. So it could be high temps, it could be moisture, it could be too dry, it could be a variety of different things, but it's usually some sort of extreme abiotic factor that's going to cause the blossom drop. So the flower stem and the calyx of the flower will turn yellow, or the calyx of the fruit could turn yellow and drop off and abort. So some of the loss is normal, like I said. Even in tomatoes, I guess you'll get some of the flowers dying off and dry and falling off. But in peppers in particular, if you're walking down a row and you will see flowers dropping off of peppers, that's very normal. Okay, blossom end rot. So this is usually caused by a calcium deficiency, but this is a little tricky because especially in our area around here in southwestern Ontario, it's not a true calcium deficiency. So our soils aren't calcium deficient. It's just actually, it's like a mocked calcium deficiency because there's not enough root pressure. So calcium is mobilized through the water. So if you're not getting enough water to that plant, it'll look like a calcium deficiency and you will get blossom end rot. Okay, so if you're seeing blossom end rot and you know that you're not in an area that has a calcium deficiency, it just means that your plants need more water, more than likely. So what does it look like? Generally, it's at the blossom end, but there are some instances where you can get blossom end rot in atypical areas. So here are some examples of blossom end rot in tomatoes, but it's not at the blossom end like we would normally expect to see, but it is caused by that mock calcium deficiency. So you can see it there in the inside of the tomato and then kind of around the outside of the green tomatoes there as well. Sun scald. So this happens when the fruit is exposed directly to the sun if they're not covered by the foliage. Last year, we saw a lot of issues in peppers with sun scald. And it was because we had a really interesting year last year. It was really wet. The plants didn't do so well. There wasn't enough foliage to cover the fruit. So there was actually a lot more sun scald than we would normally expect. So it can affect the leaves, but most oftentimes when we see it, we recognize it on the fruit. It starts off as yellow areas that were exposed, and then as it gets more severe, you'll see that they'll start to dry out and crack, and sometimes you can get secondary infections, which is you can see on that bottom right picture, where you get that black fungal growth, and that's just a secondary infection but the primary cause there is actually the sun scald. Okay, let's move into some color disorders that you'll see on the fruit. Okay, so yellow shoulder. This is a common one that you can see in tomatoes. So this actually happens shortly after fruit set, and it's caused generally by potassium and magnesium levels in the soil. So what happens here is that it looks like uneven ripening, but no matter how long you let that fruit sit on the plant, that yellow area at the top is never going to turn red. Okay, and then you can see if you cut it open that there's discoloration on the internal tissue as well. So blotchy ripening, this is usually caused by a boron or potassium deficiency. It can also be caused by things like high humidity, extreme temperatures, moisture fluctuation. As you can see, it's really hard to determine what causes a lot of these disorders, but at least now you'll have a name for them. So this can look really similar to some virus symptoms. You get a mottled green, yellow, and red fruit. Sometimes you'll get large patches of like a hard texture to the fruit. And then if you look on the inside, when you cut it open, you'll see some brown strands in the vascular tissue of that tomato fruit. So for peppers, you'll see some color spotting sometimes. So this is usually associated with cooler temperatures, but there are other things that you can see that'll cause it. These are small dark spots, okay? So these are things that are going to be less than 1/4 inch in diameter on the pepper fruit. And then silvering. So this is when the outer skin, the epidermal layer of the pepper separates from the meat of the fruit inside. So it gives it like this silvered appearance. So it could range, you could have a localized spot, or it could cover a large portion of the fruit. But be careful here because there is an insect pest called thrips. And if you happen to have high numbers of thrips in the field, they can cause a damage to the pepper fruit, tomato fruit that look really, really similar to silvering. So just, if you see something like this, look around, make sure there's not an insect pest around that might be causing this instead, because it does look really similar. Okay, purple striping. So purple striping is usually you'll see it in the fall, but in a pepper crop where they're just trying to push it a little bit, and it's caused by cooler temperatures. So you'll see patches of these purple stripes, and it could cover the majority of the pepper. For processing peppers though, you don't have to worry about this too much because the heat of the processing process, let's just say process a lot today, the heat of the whole thing that you go through and canning of the pepper fruit actually takes that purple pigmentation out. So when you look at the fruit in the jar, it doesn't have that purple striping. But fresh market, this is something that you're going to have to be concerned about if you're later in the season and they're trying to push the crop. Okay, let's look at some abnormal fruit development because you will most likely see this. Okay, cap facing. So this is actually triggered during flower development, and it's usually caused by lower temperatures. So there's scars that usually start at the blossom end, but that's why I say usually, because there's always instances where it's not going to happen that way. And then it's very variety dependent. Some varieties can get really deformed by cap facing. And it's usually observed in some of the first fruits that are set because it is cold temperatures when that flower is developing. So example, some heirloom varieties are much more highly affected by cap facing than some of the other varieties. So if you're scouting any heirlooms, you'll probably see some. This is really extreme cap facing on this heirloom tomato. So you might not see that, but it's just an example of how bad things can really get. Zippering oftentimes can be confused with cap facing. So this is also pollination problems. So this is happening in the flower stage as well before the fruit is even set. So you're looking at thin linear scars. So like pretty straight lines that extend from the stem all the way either to the bottom or part way to the bottom of the fruit. So these are starting at opposite ends. Cap facing generally starts at the bottom and zippering usually starts at the top. And sometimes you can even get fruit that open up along that scar, which is when you might confuse it with cap facing. Puffiness. So this is usually an extreme temperature situation that happens during pollination. So it results in poor pollination. You'll get development of flat sides on the tomato fruit. And then if you look on the inside of the fruit, you'll get enlarged cavities and it'll be a really light tomato when you feel it in your hand. So for pepper development, so you can get this blocky kind of fruit development here. It's usually caused by, again, extreme temperatures, really low or really high, especially when the flower buds are forming. So there's a variety here. You can see the blocky fruit there compared to a normal fruit, and then some more extreme instances of that at the bottom. Fruit cracking. So this is usually caused by alterations in the growth rate. It could be temperature fluctuations or it could be moisture. Like if it's really, really dry and then you get a lot of rain or you over irrigate, it can really push that fruit growth and it can break the skin. It can look similar to russeting or rain check, but this is triggered by temperature fluctuations in the fruit. So you'll have a warm fruit in the sun and then you have a nice cool rain and it'll cause those little tiny cracks in the skin of the fruit. And that's what the rain check is. Okay, there are some chemically induced disorders we'll go through. The first is walnut wilt. So there are species, so walnuts put out like a toxin in their root system. It's called juglone. And there are varieties of plants that are susceptible to this juglone. And solanaceous crops are one of them. Yay. So what you'll see is like a circular pattern around where the walnut is or the walnut has been. So it could be that the walnut was there a few years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, and the root system is still there and it still has some of that juglone in the soil system. So getting some history of the field might help you figure out what's going on there. But you'll get yellowing, wilting of the leaves, and then the symptoms will get milder as you get farther away from the tree. This can be confused with some diseases that Cheryl's going to cover later. So just make sure it's not a disease, take some samples and send them away before you actually determine that it's walnut wilt. Fertilizer burn, so you can see in the transplants here, this is usually caused by high salt levels. If you look at the top picture, you can see on the left-hand side some really nice, white, healthy roots on those transplants. And then if you look on, did I say left or right? I meant left. If I said right, I meant left. And then on the right-hand side, you see those dark, dead roots on the transplant, right? And then in the field, it can start off as like a burn on the outer edges of the leaf. Air pollution, There's really not much you can do about it. It usually happens on like hazy, smoggy kind of days where it's really high relative humidity, high temperatures. You'll get twisting in the leaves, some spotting, and wilting. Okay, herbicide injury. So Darren Robinson's going to be coming in here, and he's actually going to talk to you a lot about this. But if you're ever interested in the field, like, or what's going on there, you can always take a look at the crop IPM and take a look at the herbicide injury section there, and that can help you figure out what's going on too. Okay, some other helpful resources here. You should have them all in your handouts though, so you shouldn't have to pay too much attention to this slide. Are there any questions on disorders of tomatoes or peppers? Yeah.
So you said it's normal for peppers to drop some of their blossoms.
Yep.
Like how much would be like unnormal?
So if you're walking down like a field, if you're walking down a field row and you're seeing like, you know, it's hard to say. It's easier with experience, right? But like if you're seeing like a handful of pepper flowers on the ground as you're walking down, that's very normal for peppers. Now, if you're walking down and you're seeing like 10 around like a couple of plants, then I would say there's probably something going on. So it would be pretty extreme. And then the yellowing of the stem, and that should help give it away as well. Yeah, take the mask off. Oh, sorry, Paul, I'm not allowed to take the mask off. Ridgetown campus, we have to wear medical grade masks while we're in the building. I would love to take the mask off. I really would. My face is sweating profusely, but I'm not allowed. Sorry. Sandblasting. Why are there larger movements for windbreaks? So it's not just sandblasting that the windbreaks are helping. The windbreaks are also helping with soil erosion. So yes, I do believe there has been more promotion around promoting windbreaks lately. I've definitely heard, personally, I've heard a lot more about people interested in them, but it's also for soil erosion, not just for protecting the crop. Let's see if there's any. Yes, the session is being recorded, and we will make sure that it's available later on. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we are going to get Cheryl's presentation up and running here. Come on, where are you? There you are. So I just had you doing half.
Yeah.
And then a break.
That's fine.
Okay. So if you go down to file folder, you'll should be able to find it there. Give you the mic. Don't let me forget that. This is for you. Do you want to introduce yourself, or you want me to introduce you?
I can do it.
Oh my God, it keeps doing this. It's driving me crazy. Come on. There's a thing for that one. This is for that one. This is for that.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Cheryl Truman, and I'm gonna talk about disease and insects and mite pests in tomatoes and peppers. So how Amanda has this set up is first gonna do the first half of my presentation, which is on diseases, and the second half is on insect and mite pests. And so really the focus here, because this is scouting training, is just on what kind of more the major diseases and insects that you might see, and some minor ones, but I don't have as many details about the minor stuff, but it's things that you might see, but not every year, not always. And I'm not talking today about management really of any of these things. It's really scouting and monitoring techniques. If you do have questions on management, because sometimes we have people, you know, it's their first time scouting, all the way to people who are agronomist over many years of experience. So if you have questions about management, you can talk to me at the break, or you can get in touch with me like pretty much anytime, and you can see my contact information is up there, and I'm happy to do that and something I enjoy doing. The other thing that Amanda mentioned was using onvegetables.com as a resource. So we do work together on articles on management of various things. And so as I'm going through the presentation, if I remember that we've done something on management of a particular issue, I'll try to mention that here so you can check out that. So it's more up-to-date stuff reporting on some of the research that we do here. Okay, so, and I think if you're online, feel free to type your questions into the chat, and I'll probably look at them just before break. And then again, when I'm done the insect part, it's just a lot to kind of manage looking at the chat, plus the people here, plus advancing everything. If you guys have questions while we're going, then feel free to put your hand up and I can try and address them as we go. And I'll just repeat them back for the people that are on Zoom. All right, so just gonna check here. I'm really used to doing Zoom with two screens where I can see one thing, and then so this is a bit different. Okay, so what I've got right here, this is an overview of tomato and pepper diseases. And so what you see here, I've kind of indicated in the table if it affects tomato, pepper, or both, because not everything affects both. A lot of things do, but not everything. And then I've kind of split into things that we would call like crown and root diseases primarily, and then foliage and fruit. Okay, and then there's a column there called frequency. So this is like, anecdotally, like how often you might see this thing. So if it's common or sporadic, of course, it's going to depend on the specific field history and the exact region you're growing in and all that kind of thing. Okay, so we're going to touch on each of these things today to some extent. Okay, so we're going to start, we're kind of going from the top of that table on the previous slide all the way down. So we'll start with kind of crown and root disease issues and then get into foliage and fruit. So the first disease is verticillium wilt. So verticillium wilt is often something that you will notice on the foliage first, where the plants are not thriving, okay? And then when you examine things closer, you might start to see V-shaped lesions, okay? Kind of like this, okay? Yellow, like chlorosis, so yellowing. And then some discoloration, okay? Browning in the vasculature, especially at the soil line. So this is where you get your toolkit out of scouting supplies, be curious and cut out open and see, does this look normal or not? Okay, in this case, not. So in peppers, verticillium usually begins with wilting. Peppers tend to be like a little less resilient than tomatoes overall. I find like a little bit more susceptible to everything. So the symptoms tend to be a bit more extreme in peppers. And so you might see leaf yellowing, necrosis, so that's like dead tissue, okay? Leaf drop, okay? And poor growth overall, okay? And you can see in peppers, the previous slide, the symptoms were in tomato. This is in peppers where it's just like a lot more necrosis, okay? A bit more extreme, okay? So verticillium wilt, just monitor for symptoms during the season. It's caused by a soil-borne fungus. So anything that symptom you're looking, you think it's verticillium, you should send samples to a lab to confirm with testing that that's the cause, okay? Because other things can cause symptoms like this, okay? Stress, nutrient issues, nematodes, etc. You can also test soils in the spring or fall for the pathogen itself to see if that soil is infested. And so May, June, or September, October is the ideal time to do that testing. Okay. Yes.
Is it specific pathogen specific to tomatoes and peppers, or is it the same one that affects?
Yeah. So the question is it one kind of species that affects tomatoes and another for peppers? There's more than one verticillium species, but they both have a broad host range. So they'll both affect tomatoes and peppers, as well as a bunch of other plants. Woody plants and herbaceous plants, like a really broad range. So yeah, great question. Okay, so that's verticillium. Nematodes, okay, so there's many species of nematodes, many types. I just kind of touch on them briefly here. You know, nematodes, when we start to see problems with nematodes, we have a high population. We'll talk about, we'll see weak areas of the field, not necessarily with an explanation about why that's weak, or people will say like if the soil is tired. And you'll start to see reduced yield, and some lesions will cause lesions on the roots, or abnormal root growth, so galls, like you see in their upper right-hand picture. In the lower right-hand picture with the blue background, those are symptoms caused by root lesion nematode, but many other soil-borne pathogens can also cause symptoms that are similar to that. So this is another example where you need to confirm that nematodes are present, okay, and at what level with a lab test. So we talk about diseases, we talk a lot about some things you can diagnose with confidence in the field, and other things you want to be sure and need to be confirmed with a lab test. So root samples can be sent kind of anytime during the season to the lab. If you want to test soil, the recommendations are to do in the spring or fall. And OMAFRA has fact sheets on how to do this and how to do sampling. Nematodes can be very patchy within a field. They don't move very far on their own. So follow those guidelines, okay? And myself or Amanda would be a great resource if you're gonna do nematode testing to talk to you about that. Overall, so I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago now, there was a project where surveys were done in Essex, Kent, and Norfolk in tomato fields. A lot of the similar ground would be used for peppers, okay, where they looked at what the nematode populations were, these different sites. And overall, the levels were really low, okay? So individual fields, there was a few individual fields that had high numbers, but overall pretty low. So you see an issue that could be nematodes, could also be something else. So getting tested and double checking is good. Don't just assume it's nematodes. Okay. Excuse me.
Cheryl, there's a nematode survey actually going on this year. Anyone's interested in.
Okay, so Amanda said there's a nematode survey going on this year as well. So if you are interested in participating in that, just contact Amanda.
Yeah, me or Albert Tenuta or Katie Goldenhar, and they're looking for varieties of crops from all over Ontario.
Okay, so that's all over Ontario. Albert Tenuta, Katie Goldenhar, or Amanda. Okay. All right. So the next disease called Phytophthora crown and root rot. This again affects tomatoes and peppers. And I don't put the species name for the causal agent in a lot of this, okay? But for this one I do, because I really want you to be familiar with it. So this is Phytophthora capsicum. And this is a really aggressive pathogen, okay? And especially in peppers, but also increasingly in tomatoes. So these pictures are pepper fields, okay, in Essex and Kent. So in the first one, that low spot where everything is brown, okay, those are dead peppers that have died from Phytophthora, okay, from Phytophthora capsicum. Then again, what you see here in the picture on the right, okay, is dead peppers. Okay, typically what we see is the wilting of the plant, of the entire plant. So kind of in that lower right-hand corner there, and then these peppers will die. Okay. And if you look closer, the picture on the right, you'll see that black, almost black or very dark brown canker from the soil line moving up. Okay, so that is pretty typical of Phytophthora capsicum. Okay, and if you look at the vasculature, you'll see that discoloration, okay, in that canker. Sorry, forgot to advance the slide. Okay. So again, that's why we have a knife, okay, so we can do these examinations and take a closer look. The fruit will kind of be shriveled, almost like mummified, okay, and you may see kind of whitish mycelium and sporulation on the interior and exterior of the fruit. Okay. So Phytophthora is very nasty. Okay, it's soil borne and it spreads in water, and it can be very aggressive. So there was a lot observed last year when it was very wet. Okay, so it is spreading, and if we have conditions that are favorable for disease, so heavy rain events and lots of moisture, then it will be severe and you will start to see it. It also affects cucurbits, especially as another major host. Okay, these are some symptoms in tomatoes. And in tomatoes, this is a big issue in Essex County. Okay, we know that it's present in tomato growing areas in Kent. We haven't seen the extent of the fruit rot here yet. Okay, we also know that Phytophthora capsicum is present in Norfolk County. Okay, it could be elsewhere, but we don't know that for sure. But we've gotten reports from the kind of the big vegetable growing areas in Ontario. In tomatoes, we tend not to see that total plant wilt and collapse. Doesn't happen as quickly in tomatoes. You might see kind of yellowing at the base of the plant. You can have the entire plant dying in that typical like black canker coming from the soil line. But the big issue that we are seeing in tomatoes right now is buckeye rot, like really severe buckeye rot. So that's where you see this smooth brown on green fruit is very apparent. Okay, and on ripened fruit, these kind of turn into like little water sacks, okay, of rotten fruit. They're completely unmarketable. Okay, really, really gross actually. Really stinky, and you'll get all kinds of secondary organisms in there as well as breaking down. It's really important, okay, to correctly kind of identify this pathogen because a lot of the management methods are specific to Phytophthora. Okay, right, like fungicides that are used for diseases caused by fungi are largely ineffective against things like Phytophthora capsicum. So it really changes the management program for that specific site. Okay, so these are some more pictures of buckeye rot. So you can have sometimes concentric light and dark rings. Okay, the surface will remain smooth. I'm going to talk about rot caused by late blight, okay, in a little while, and that is like an orange peel texture, same color, but like a different texture on the surface. Okay, you might get sporulation, so that's that white stuff here, okay, where the organism is reproducing. Other species of Phytophthora can cause buckeye rot, but when it's really severe, become suspicious of Phytophthora capsicum, or if you're seeing other symptoms. Okay. So we've had buckeye rot present as a disease for a long time, but when Phytophthora capsicum is present, it tends to be much worse. Okay, I think I covered kind of most of this stuff. Okay, so this is kind of for your benefit for when you go home. I guess the two bottom points I'll emphasize: typically first see symptoms in low spots or wet spots in the field. And another consideration is to consider biosecurity measures when moving between fields, because if you're moving water or soil between fields, you are going to be spreading it around. So we don't do research on this pathogen here on campus because I don't want it in every vegetable range. So we go to where we know it is, and we make sure that we wash and disinfect our footwear, for example, before coming back to campus. If you want some tips on how to do that and put together a biosecurity kit, Amanda is a great person to talk to about that. She's got kind of a list and all that jazz. There are other crown and root rots that affect tomatoes and peppers. So some of those things are caused by things like Fusarium, Pythium. If we see a general decline in growth, okay, we want to see a processing tomato field that looks kind of like this one on the left, okay, versus on the right where the rows are not filled in, okay. If the root system, if the plants are not thriving, take a look at the root system and what do you observe? Does it look healthy? Is it large? Do we have white roots? Like Anne's going to talk more about this later on, I think. Or is there browning, decay, etc.? You can't diagnose all this stuff visually. You'd say you need to send samples to a lab and start to narrow things down. It's kind of complicated to diagnose root and crown problems. But you can at least identify if there's an issue that needs further investigation. Okay. So now we're going to move into foliar and fruit diseases. We're going to start off with those that are caused by bacterial pathogens. So the first one is bacterial canker. Okay, in bacterial canker, you can have a systemic infection, or what we call a primary infection, or a secondary infection. So first, we'll talk about primary infections, which are actually fairly rare in field production. Okay, so that's a difference from greenhouse, where this is kind of opposite. Okay, so systemic infections, not as common. Okay, what you'll tend to see, so there's a patch here, not showing up really great on this slide, of wilting. Okay, sometimes the wilting will start on one side of the plant. Okay. You look closer, you may see stem cracking. Okay, discoloration of the pith vessels, which will evolve into this more severe discoloration, and then this advanced decay you see here. Okay, so when you're crop scouting, remember to always be curious, investigate, take a look at things. Okay. If it's a secondary infection, so this is like an aerial infection, this is what we most commonly see in the field. We tend to just see symptoms on the foliage and on the fruit. And on the foliage, we usually see this firing on the leaf margins. Okay, so those leaves have hydrophils, which is like a natural opening where water comes out. Okay, so that's a natural opening where the bacteria kind of migrate in. Okay, and that's why you're seeing the firing there. Okay, and then on the fruit, we get this bird's eye spots on the fruit. These bird's eye spots can be confused with the very early symptoms of bacterial spot, but they'll just stay looking like that. They won't get a dark spot or grow larger. Bacterial speck, okay, is another disease caused by bacteria. It tends to be more prominent in cooler conditions. Okay, sometimes we'll see it in June and the plants will kind of grow out of it. Okay, it's not as aggressive in general as bacterial spot, okay, which we'll talk about next. So the symptoms on foliage are, you cannot distinguish visually from bacterial spot. They both have small brown specks, okay, about 2 millimeters in diameter. Sometimes you will see a yellow halo, so that's just yellow chlorosis around that dark lesion, okay, but you don't always see that, okay. The lesions will come together and then you'll eventually leads to defoliation of the plant. Okay. On fruit, okay, you'll get lesions that are usually about 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter, right? And slightly raised off the surface like a scab. Okay, so you think about, you cut yourself and you have like a little scab there, so there'll be a little bump if you run your finger across it. You won't get new infections on red fruit. The fruit are only susceptible in like a smaller green stage. Okay, so bacterial spot generally causes more economic damage than bacterial speck. Okay, then on the foliage, the symptoms are very similar to speck. You really can't tell the difference. Okay, I can't tell the difference. No one can. Okay, on fruit, okay, you have the lesions that tend to be larger, okay, than speck, and less scab-like. And some of the organisms that cause this will cause, like, the lesions will be large and they'll kind of crack open, and then you'll get other organisms in there that, like, kind of make it worse, and you get more decay. So these diseases are economically important because they can affect the foliage. So you lose your foliage early, and it leads to more sun scald, like Amanda was talking about earlier. But also for fresh market tomatoes or processing tomatoes that are going to be whole pack, okay, when they put these tomatoes through the peeling process in the processing plant, you end up with skin tags where these don't always come off. And then people open up their can and there's like these little black spots in there and it looks gross, right? So you get lots of complaints. I just see something in the chat there, so I'm just gonna see what it is. Okay, does advanced bacterial canker cause stem hollowing in tomatoes or just the discolorate? You can kind of have, like, if the pith decay is sufficient, I think you would see some hollowing. You can also have hollowing of the stem with lightning damage. I'm trying to think, is there anything else, Amanda, off the top of your head?
Erwinia, like bacteria.
Yeah, Erwinia, like bacterial stem infection that's caused by different bacteria, which is not very common, but it is also a possibility. So yeah, so look at all the symptoms kind of together when trying to figure out what it is. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this is just an example. This, is full of bacterial spot, and say we see defoliation, loss of foliage here. You can also have bacterial spot develop on tomato transplants. Okay, and so if you notice this, it is important to report it and say, because if the plants are going into the field and they already have spot, then if we have wet conditions and through the spring and where those plants are establishing, we can kind of set up for a really rotten season. So if you see bacterial spot on transplants, it does look a little bit differently than what it looks like in the field. And so you might look at this and say, that doesn't look too bad. But if you look really closer, if you look right here, that's bacterial spot starting right there. Okay, so just some small brown spots. Sometimes transplants can get different physiological disorders. Okay, this is an example here. Sometimes we see this. This is not bacterial spot. Okay, this is bacterial spot. Okay, it's not that easy to tell the difference. So if you're unsure, then you ask for help. You ask for another. Okay, bacterial spot also affects peppers. So in peppers, you tend to have a larger yellow halo, okay, and a more consistent halo than you would in tomatoes. And the other thing that happens in peppers is you see this. So you get leaf drop. So you'll just be walking along, you'll see leaves that have just abscised from the plant. We don't really see that in tomatoes, but that's a pepper thing. And it's not common to see bacterial spot symptoms on pepper fruit at all. So those are the bacterial diseases. But now we're going to talk about some fungal diseases. Okay, so we'll start with early blight. If you're scouting potatoes, it's the same pathogen that affects potatoes as tomatoes. Okay, so Alternaria. So your symptoms will start off quite small and dark brown. So at this stage, you could confuse with speck or spot, but they will grow larger, okay, and more advanced, and you'll look for alternating rings. Okay, here, leaf yellowing and then defoliation. It's not very common, but you can get symptoms develop on the fruit. You see down here. Okay, it kind of looks similar to blossom end rot, but it's at the stem end. Okay. Other Alternaria species can also cause something called black mold, and this is usually associated with overripe fruit. Okay, but last year we did see high incidence reported on fruit that should otherwise have been okay, so they weren't sitting in the field for a long time. Okay, so this is kind of the early stages you see here, and then as it advances, you might see this black velvety stuff that's it's sporulating there. So this is something where you're going to start evaluating in fungicide trials. There seems to be potentially some association with which cultivar is grown, but there's still a lot to learn here. But it's something to keep an eye out, especially if you're scouting processing tomatoes. Septoria leaf spot is another fungal disease that tends to be sporadic, but when it does occur, it can be very aggressive. Okay, so you can see that here, no fungicide versus a fungicide treated plots where we've got virtually 100% defoliation here. Okay, so with Septoria leaf spot, the lesions tend to stay fairly small. Okay, but the diagnostic sign that you're looking for here is using your hand lens and looking for little black specks of these lesions. And those black specks are called pignidia, and it's a fruiting body for the fungus. So that's where the spores develop and are released. Okay, so when we have diseases that have fruiting bodies that are produced where we can see them, it's a great diagnostic tool for field diagnosis. So you'll see the lesions stay relatively small, but they join together and this can be quite aggressive, and then this is the end result. Okay. Then anthracnose fruit rot. So you can have symptoms develop on foliage, but these tend to be really minor and distinct. The major issue is on fruit. So we start with kind of a sunken area that looks water soaked, okay, on ripe fruit. On tomatoes, you should only see this on ripe fruit, I hope. Okay, and it almost looked like someone took their thumb kind of pressed in on the tomato, but it didn't come back out, okay? And then as it advances, you get these blackened areas in there. Okay, and then eventually you can see salmon colored kind of masses, and that's where the spores are produced. Okay, and then you'll see typical symptoms on peppers here, kind of similar. If you've got sun scald, okay, the fruit will be more susceptible. Okay. What we are starting to see, okay, in this growing area is a really aggressive form of anthracnose on peppers. Okay, it seems to only affect capsicum species. Okay, so it's a new species of, or not a new species of fungus, but new to Ontario. And the really critical thing about this is it's very challenging because symptoms appear on immature and ripe fruit. So typically with anthracnose, we would just see symptoms on ripe fruit. Now we're seeing an immature fruit. So you still have these sunken lesions, okay, salmon colored spores produced, but very aggressive, like you can see here, where last year Amanda and I were in a field and at least 80% of every fruit in that field had symptoms. Okay, that might even be an underestimate, being generous. Okay. So if you are scouting peppers and you start to see anthracnose, okay, make sure that it is reported. I'm sure Amanda would love to know. Okay, and especially if you see it on green fruit that are not ripe yet. Okay, that is a lot of alarm bells, and there's a lot of implications for how to manage the disease for the grower that you're scouting for. Okay, now late blight of tomato. Okay, same late blight, same disease as on potato. Okay, so all above ground plant parts can be affected. Okay, you'll get these irregular kind of lesions. They look greasy and kind of water soaked and wet through stems, leaves, fruit. Okay, this is that orange peel texture that I was talking about earlier, so different than buckeye rot. On the undersides of leaves that have this, if you flip that over, especially on like a damp August morning or it's foggy, you will see this like white velvety stuff. That's the organism sporulating, it's reproducing. Okay, that's the best time to see that, but that's the diagnostic for late blight. Okay, this can be a very aggressive disease if tomatoes are not protected with the right fungicides, or they don't have any host resistance. And so it is what we would call a community disease, where if you do see it, it'd be very much appreciated if you could notify OMAFRA or myself so that we can confirm it, but also so that everyone in the area is on alert to make sure that their crop is protected, because it can take out like an entire tomato field in a week. It's like no joke at all. So very, very aggressive. Okay, I think I talked about all that stuff. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, botrytis gray mold, it's not something I see a lot in the field. Sometimes see it on transplants, but we'll cover the basics here. Right? So you can occur on any plant parts and on fruit. This organism tends to be kind of everywhere in the environment. Excuse me. And so it tends to affect when we have really humid or wet conditions, and it tends to be more successful in affecting kind of weaker tissues like blossoms and that kind of thing, and new growth. So the tissue will kind of have like a melting appearance, girdled stems. You see here, you can get this gray sporulation. So if you've seen like strawberries or raspberries with gray mold, okay, it's the same organism. So that kind of gray sporulation, kind of see it up here. Okay, and on fruit, okay, you can have ghost spotting develop. Okay, these are kind of the result of unsuccessful infections, and then just general rotting. On transplants, these are transplants that came in a few years ago. We had kind of like the weather now, where it's like not that sunny and kind of wet, and it's hard to keep like stuff hard to get stuff to dry out in the greenhouse every day, and then you get these moisture buildup, and you can see this stem rot here and on the leaves as well. Okay, white mold. So this is another one that I would say is pretty sporadic, but like both Amanda and I have seen it in tomatoes, especially tomato fields that have really lush growth in a big canopy. Because you get conditions inside that canopy that are high humidity, don't dry out as fast, and it makes it really ideal for infection for this pathogen. If you're scouting crops like soybeans, okay, same disease, okay, same pathogen. So isn't it confusing because sometimes it's the same pathogen in other crops, okay, and sometimes it isn't, right? So so some key things with white mold, you'll get this bleaching of the stem where it's really bleached out, okay? And if you look closer, you'll see kind of this cottony growth, okay, with mycelium. And then if you look closer, okay, you might see these hard black bodies, and those are hardened black bodies of mycelium. That's how it overwinters in soil, okay? Initially, those will be white and kind of hard, and then they'll turn that black color, okay? So that's something that you might see particularly later on in the season. There are many viruses that affect tomatoes and peppers. I don't talk about them a lot here because unlike in greenhouse production, they tend to be relatively minor issues. We do see them, okay, but they tend not to wipe out a whole field, okay? And so some typical symptoms of viruses like abnormal growth, like with the leaf shape or thickened stems, mottling, stunting, poor fruit set. So if you're seeing stuff like this, it's something to consider, okay? Sometimes the symptoms can be confused with some of the disorders that Amanda talked about, nutrient disorders, some environmental things, sometimes herbicide injury, okay? But keep an open mind if you're seeing like stuff like that to rule out viruses. Okay, powdery mildews. So there's a powdery mildew of peppers and a powdery mildew of tomatoes. Both are fairly rare in outdoor production, okay, but they can occur. Not caused by the same pathogen, but both called powdery mildew, okay? So in peppers, okay, you'll see, and this is actually, these are pictures from a greenhouse, but right here. So you'll see discoloration and chlorosis on the upper side of the leaf, but the mildew will form on the lower side of the leaf only, okay? Which is not a typical powdery mildew symptom when we think about all the powdery mildews that we see in the landscape, especially towards the end of the summer, okay? So that's on peppers. On tomatoes, there's a few species that can cause powdery mildew on tomatoes, but the kind of one that we typically see, it's kind of standard powdery mildew symptoms where you get this powdery mold growing across the upper leaf surface here, okay? But yeah, not that common in the field. There are some different bacterial soft rots that you can see, especially in peppers. These are often associated where there's injury from something else, okay? And then you get these bacteria in. It'd be slimy, gooey, stinky, and generally gross, and it'll be worse if the weather is warm and wet. Yes, there's a question.
Yeah, like on the stem, is that like bacterial spot?
I do not know what that is, but I'd be hesitant. Yeah, do you know, Amanda?
So with peppers, it could be a lot of different things, because there's a lot of other abiotics.
Yeah,
Like
like
similar symptoms, like peppers in general are just really, really sensitive to light in general. So I wouldn't, without actual symptoms on the fruit itself or on the leaves, especially with peppers on the leaves.
Yeah.
So if there were similar symptoms on the leaves, I would probably be in the same area you're at. I think that it was probably bacterial spot.
We don't have
But
enough
without these
context.
symptoms,
Yeah, I didn't take the picture and see the field. So for the zoomers, the question was on that green pepper fruit, if it was bacterial spot on the stem. And Amanda and I are just saying that we don't know and that we don't have really enough information on a situation. I think if you've seen that, like send a sample into Amanda. She could probably get it tested.
I've seen that, and it turned out to be a newer thing called Fusarium internal rot, especially around your area. So I've seen that, and it turned out to be something else, but it would really depend on what other symptoms were there.
So I was just realized I didn't put internal fruit rot in this presentation, but I probably should next year. Anyways,
Yeah,
we can talk about that.
hopefully this year I
I'm
can
trying
get
not to
that
make it
picture.
too long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have lots of slides on it from teaching. Okay, so it's break time.
Yeah, we're only gonna do 10 minutes.
Okay.
To try and save a little bit of time.
I need to get a drink of water. I'm losing my
Yeah,
voice.
do you want to just tell them we're only gonna take a 10?
Oh yeah, we are going to take a 10-minute break, and I will write that in the chat.
So that means we'll be back at 10:45.
Oh, I should probably mention Rugo saying, just in case anybody is. Oh, you want to give me the mic, Cheryl? I'm gonna keep it plugged in.
Yeah, they probably don't want to hear me.
I don't know if it goes that far.
There's also insects that can cause that same type of damage on the stem too, so. Yeah, it could be, well, are you doing fresh market peppers mostly or processing? Okay, because it could be, because mechanical damage can cause that, like if the fruit's being handled a lot, like if, especially fresh market, if you're tying and training and things get scraped, you can get that. There's insect pests that can cause that, like I've seen it where if you have pepper weevil, which is really unlikely in field pepper, you can get feeding marks on the stem, same with some other insect pests. And then like I've seen it associated with Fusarium internal rot. Like it's just, there's so many things that you'd have to see if there's other symptoms to kind of give you more of a direction. But hey, Karen, I'll fill you in on this situation.
We're good. Cheryl just did.
Oh, okay.
I've got.
We're late and this is really complicated now.
What I did was I made up, the pictures in the slides are a little bit hard to see, so I made some copies of just a few.
Okay, cool. Do you want me to hand those out for you?
Oh, sure, you can do that right.
Or they can.
You have this on.
I did, I put it in, they're in their
There,
folders, yeah.
yeah, okay.
If you guys want, there's some nice color pictures up here of some herbicide injury. If you'd like to have a little bit more detailed pictures on those, you can come and grab.
Yeah, I'm gonna point it out when I talk, just because the images in the PDF are good, most of them, but some of them, what I had to do is take the images, all of them like experiment.
Yeah.
Yep, yeah.
So what's going on with the computer is for some reason, that it didn't want to recognize my computer. So the projectors wouldn't work with my computer, but Zoom is on my computer. So you need to talk to the computer for Zoom and advance the slides on the computer for Zoom. And then you have to advance the slides on the other monitor. for
Oh, so
live.
we're running.
So we're doing two computers. It's super fun. Yeah.
It's funny, I remember the first time that I did that in the classroom, not this past fall, but the first year that we had this, that's exactly what I had.
It's very frustrating.
Had to bring my computer into the room because the computer I was in, but it didn't have the computer there, didn't have the ability to Zoom, right?
Well, I don't have a camera to be able to do it on the
Yeah.
other computer for Zoom, and I'm just like, so we went with plan B 2.0, and
I was
started
going
20 minutes
to,
late.
I was going to use like the highlighter, like here, but it's like too much.
I know.
So-
Just remember to advance those slides at the same
Yeah,
time
I
as well.
mostly did. so.
So registered, we have 11 registered for in person. We have 8, I think, and then we had 44 this morning registered. I just got an updated number for Zoom.
Okay.
So there is quite a few people on Zoom. So, and then we have a lapel mic for the Zoom people because I figured for it. So just a little fill in on the complications of this morning.
I did, like, I didn't stick my head in, but I saw. I saw.
We probably saw me and Cheryl running around like chickens with our heads cut off trying to figure this out.
Well, like Cheryl had to ask about
Yeah, there's an advantage.
my adapter, you know, with the grad student.
I have one at home because my monitor, my secondary monitor at home is VGA, but like, I don't think to bring that.
The grad students have. It's like, I have the little plastic sheet or the little plastic bag that I use to hold it. But that's-
So Doug said he just ordered a bunch more because his last one, he zip tied it to the garage.
around anyone, so the notes were in there, and then I just cut it off.
Yeah, make sure you grab that.
But I think I'm just gonna get a second one. Just.
I'm gonna
because
order a bunch too
they're
and
always
just leave them.
Well, it sucks because like all our computers are VGA, but none of the tech like that you need to hook up to is VGA or HDMI. These are HDMI. This is VGA. It's just a disaster. This is from here, I thought, but I guess not. I don't know where this is.
Oh,
from.
yeah, it was on that.
You sure? It doesn't look like it'll fit. Does it fit? Oh, okay. I'm just special. It's all good.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes. I'm just charging the lapel mic, so it hopefully doesn't die. Yay, Amazon.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, We're about 15 minutes behind. No. So we were right on time. If we wouldn't have been late, everything would have been fine. Not as bad as I thought.
Yeah, and I don't know if I might.
Okay, I'll stick my head in.
I would, like, are you talking a lot about stick bug?
There's probably covered.
I seem to be the only vegetable specialist worried about stick bugs for some reason. I was talking to Hannah, she's like, nobody else is even bringing up stick bug. I'm like, oh, I am very worried about stick bug. Like, but apparently, like, the crops I cover are the only ones that are experiencing like big issues other than field crops.
Yeah,
But
I
like,
mean, I don't really are. Yeah, I mean, essentially. It probably says.
it doesn't matter.
Pardon?
The brown marmoset for sure, but what we're seeing is one spot, actually what we're catching the most of, and we're seeing the most, things and stuff on, and tomatoes. And it's one spot.
Yeah, actually, I have some examples of different species, but I don't get into too. I don't really. get into
I was just
species.
curious.
But just predatory versus plant.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
And the damage. So,
I'm happy that Mike's working out. I didn't get approval to buy one, so I got one. Isn't that always? I'm like, fine, I'll just buy one. It just makes life so much easier.
The toughest end, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh,
I think they mostly just saw my neck. I just looked at
They
the
just saw
video.
this.
Yeah,
Well,
because
you
I'm
were
taller.
hand gesturing though, but they saw your hand gesture.
So there, I just.
Yeah, originally I
Just
was
change
hoping
that.
like the Zoom could be on the table and you'd be able to like move around a little bit, like had other plans for us today. I'm gonna make some notes of what went wrong this year, so for next year, I can be a little bit more prepared for these things.
Okay, should I just
Yeah,
start?
you might as
started?
well. It's recorded anyways.
Okay, and this is on?
Yep.
Okay, so we are going to get started. Again, I think almost everyone's back. Oh, there's a chat. Okay, great. So Amanda, just check the chat after because someone sent a message that they can assist with the nematode survey. It was just a direct message to you though, so yeah.
Okey-doke.
So thank you. I passed on the message. All right. Okay, so we're gonna now cover insect and mite pests. And so it'll be kind of the same format that we did for insects. So this again is kind of summarizes the major ones and if they affect tomato and pepper or both, and some kind of general information on the frequency. Okay, so the first pest is black cutworm. So this is more of like a generalist pest, so you might see it in other crops as well. Okay, and so it's this pest we see to be in the spring. And the damaging stage is the larval stage, so with the caterpillar stage. And so you can see up here, we've got the identification. So it's kind of overall greasy appearance. Okay, you've got these pale bands along the top of the body. Okay, paired spots. Okay, on the segments, and a head with 2 black stripes. Okay, and so what these cutworms will do is they will kind of cut, essentially, like the name suggests, they will kind of cut or snip, okay, the seedlings, okay, and it almost looks like someone like just took a pair of scissors and cut off the tops, okay. These are active at night, so you'll tend to see the damage and not the cutworm. But if you dig around in the soil, okay, around the base of the plant, sometimes you can find the cutworm, and when they're disturbed, they have this typical cutworm behavior where they'll kind of curl up, like you see in that picture on the upper right-hand corner. And so we observe damage in the spring. Okay, most of the time, you'll see the snipping. Okay, weedy areas are more attractive to the female moths to lay their eggs, so that's where we tend to see more damage, as well as near field edges. Okay, all right, so that's black cutworm. Okay, next pest is Colorado potato beetle. Okay, same Colorado potato beetle that affects potatoes. Okay, this is just a tomato pest. And these are most damaging in the spring, and I've been in the first few weeks after transplanting. Okay, so the eggs you'll see here are these bright orange. Okay, they'll be typically laid on the underside of the leaves. So you see this picture is actually not a fabulous picture of the seedling because it's a little bit blurry because it was windy when I took this. But what I was trying to demonstrate here is that you really have to be paying attention and look at the undersides of the leaves. This is a windy day, they might flip up and you'll see that. But if it's a calm day, you could walk by, and if you're not bending over and really inspecting the plants, you might miss those. Okay. And then we see some early instar larvae, okay, emerging out of there, and those feed on the foliar parts of the plant. Okay, the larvae have 2 black spots along the side, okay, along the sides, and they kind of have a similar appearance with each instar, just getting bigger and bigger. The adults, okay, are pretty distinct. You'll see these 10 black stripes on their wings, okay, and you see some pictures of the damage in the upper right-hand corner there. You'll see a seedling that's been mostly consumed. Okay, this is where the biggest economic impact happens because that poor plant is losing all its foliage, is losing its energy factory. Okay, if they're not controlled, you can get into situations you see at the bottom of the screen there, where you've got plants that are bearing fruit and they really have no hope of having a high yield because they don't have the foliage there to support that. So that's a picture from a trial, like an insecticide trial we were doing where we were testing different products. So the adults are pretty slow moving. So these are fairly like easy to scout for, and they're not going to fly or bounce away. Okay. You'll see the larvae and the adults kind of in the same environment. Okay, they're both defoliators. And there are thresholds that are established. So these are listed on the Ontario Crop IPM, but in the first 2 weeks after transplanting, looking at 0.5 adults or larvae per plant, and then later on in the season that increases to 1 per plant because it can withstand damage a little bit better. Okay, wireworms are the next pest, so another kind of generalist pest. But in tomatoes, have you seen wireworm damage in peppers, Amanda? I guess I didn't really check with you on that. I haven't.
Maybe once or twice.
Maybe
but
once
it's
or
like a
twice.
one-off.
Yeah,
It's
so
not-
generally an issue in tomatoes. And we're seeing maybe more reports of this since growers have been unable to use imidacloprid insecticide in furrow, which repels wireworms from feeding during the kind of very critical time. So wireworms are copper colored, thin, and soil dwelling. Okay, you'll look for these 3 pairs of thoracic legs that are in that red circle with the head up here. Don't confuse with millipedes, which have lots and lots of legs, okay, and not just thoracic legs and are a different color, all right? And so what we're seeing, these are the adults, which are like a click beetle, okay, which are not so important. So what we're seeing with tomatoes is that they will feed on the roots and get kind of burrow into the stem on newly established tomato plantings. You can see the damage here. So this plant that really doesn't have, it's not going to survive to produce a crop. And then if you dig around in the soil, like often you can find the wireworm still there. So it's kind of small, but in this photo on the upper right, you can see that kind of copper colored wireworm that's right here next to this affected seedling. So it is possible to put out bait traps to monitor for wireworm, although there's not really strong evidence that that predicts that you will, whether or not you will see damage. But it is possible at least to check if they are there. And closely monitor seedlings after transplanting, okay, especially on sandy knolls or fields where there's been a history of wireworm damage in the past, to at least determine what the level of damage is. There isn't anything that can be done at that point, but it's still good to know if they are present. Okay, variegated cutworm is the next pest. This is a pest of tomato, okay? So you can see there's a range of colorations, okay? We look in the blue picture down there, some of the key features. So this mottled colored body, okay, gray to brownish, head with dark brown net-like pattern, okay? And you have these kind of yellow or whitish spots along the middle of the back. This is the frass deposit here. These will often burrow into fruit, okay, during the day and hang out there during the day and feed at night. Okay, so this is a cutworm, unlike the black cutworm, we tend to see damage kind of through the main part of the summer as opposed to the spring. It does not overwinter here typically. And so we have a migrating population that comes in and you don't always know, like usually sometime in July, okay, but they don't book a flight on a specific date, right? Occasionally we have seen damage in the spring during kind of black cutworms, when we have a black cutworm season, when we have more of a mild winter. We've seen it in Essex County where there is an overwintering population that damages kind of at the time of transplanting. So it is possible to set up a trapping program using pheromone traps to monitor for these. I don't really cover the installation and all the details here, but those are well detailed in Ontario Crop IPM and what to do. For scouting plants, remember that they hide during the day. Look for the leaf feeding as well, okay? And there's a threshold of one larvae per 30 plants, okay? So look for leaf feeding, look for damage to the fruit. Okay, cabbage loopers. So usually we see cabbage looper damage beginning in mid-July. The larvae tend to be kind of smooth colored, pale green, and you'll see the thin white line on each side, okay? And then these 2 faint lines across the back. And it will move like an inchworm, okay, because it has 3 abdominal prolegs, so you get kind of this inchworm movement, okay? There is a threshold established for a cabbage looper of 15 larvae per 30 plants, okay? This is what some of the feeding can look like, okay? And you'll see some different stages of development of the caterpillar. You see frass here, these little dark green or black looking pellets. When the larvae are smaller, okay, the damage will be like more window painting, okay, whereas further on you get these larger ragged holes. Keep in mind, there are other loopers species that have been identified recently in Ontario and especially in the Essex County area. They are indistinguishable from cabbage looper just based on, I was going to say symptoms, but just based on the physical features of the caterpillar. So the tomato looper and soybean looper also been reported to be present. They cause similar damage, but it's just to be aware it might not necessarily be cabbage looper. Okay, and so these pictures on the previous slide, okay, I'll just go back there, were taken in processing tomatoes a few years ago in Essex County in mid to late August, and the whole field looked like this. It was very, very surprising, but I didn't have these identified. Okay, you need to basically test DNA to determine what they are. But it was quite severe in that case. The fields were going to be harvested soon, so in that case, it wasn't going to affect yield. But if they came in earlier, okay, it would be something to really be aware of that might require control. Okay, more caterpillars. Okay, so this is tomato fruitworm. Okay, so that's what we call it in tomatoes. But if you're scouting corn, okay, it's corn earworm, same species. Okay, we just have these common names that are associated with the host crop. Corn earworm can be up to 3.7 centimeters long. Okay, so like 1.5 inches. You see these double stripes. And the color can also really vary from pale green, okay, to yellow to pinkish brown. Okay, and they again will burrow into the fruit. You can see on the right here. So another reason to have a knife, excuse me, so you can cut those fruit open and see what you can find inside. Okay. Hornworms, so tomato and tobacco hornworm, you might also see occasionally. These are really tricky, like they're pretty common in home gardens as well. And they initially like blend in really well with the tomato plant. And then once you start to find them, then you start to see them everywhere. If they get up to 8 centimeters long, it's just kind of amazing. But that means they can really actually consume a lot of foliage in that time. So often we don't see these as much in commercial fields that are being sprayed with other insecticides or other pests, because they'll also kill bees. But they can show up, okay? And so tobacco hornworm, you have these V-shaped, or sorry, with tomato hornworm, you have V-shaped marks, okay? With tobacco hornworm, there's like a diagonal, okay, mark like that, and this spike on the end, okay? And so they'll feed on foliage as well as fruit, you would see here, okay? Sometimes what you might see is these strange structures protruding from a hornworm. Those are actually beneficial. So this is parasitized by braconid wasps. So that's like a good thing to see. Okay, so those are hornworms, which you might see occasionally. In peppers, European corn borer can be a pest, okay? And there's really low tolerance for corn borer because they burrow into the fruit. And then, you know, the consumer has the fruit and there's a caterpillar inside and people don't like that, right? Except for me, I was very excited that picture on the upper right-hand corner. I bought that at the grocery store. And yeah, corn borer, got the camera. Okay, so corn borers, they're kind of greasy, kind of up to 1 inch long, dark head, okay, and a spot on each segment. The egg masses, okay, will have these kind of fish scale appearance, right? And then what they'll do on peppers is that they will actually enter into the pepper fruit at the calyx. So this is kind of a hole here, okay? And I was just reading about this a couple of weeks ago, based on the size of the pepper. I think it has to be like at least 3.8 centimeters in diameter is when they will start to bore into the fruit. They can also bore into the stem, but the primary issue is boring into fruit. Okay, and then you can see here they have this nice little buffet home to grow and develop. Okay, so corn borers can be monitored with traps, pheromone traps. There are not as many corn borers around as there used to be, but they are still an important pest of peppers. So one thing I wanted to highlight was some of these caterpillar pests, because there are pests on some other crops, especially some of the larger acreage field crops. There are some efforts to have these big monitoring networks that are in place. So one project that's going on that some folks out of BAFRA, oh my gosh, it's really hard to not drink water during this.
You want some water?
Do you have any bottles of water? Yeah, if you've got any. There's a Great Lakes and Maritime Pest Monitoring Network that's happening for a corn borer, corn earworm, and black cutworm. So I've highlighted those because they are directly related to the crops that we're talking about today. But if you're scouting other things, these other insects might be of interest. So they're doing real-time maps that are posted during the growing season of what the moth catches are in these regions. And if you follow that link, you can learn more about that. Okay, and there's a whole website dedicated to this. You can look up this information. So this can be helpful, kind of keep you on your toes. Okay, and when populations are starting to rise, kind of focus your scouting efforts. And also it might be something that you want to be involved with. Okay, two-spotted spider mites. Holy moly. So spider mites are really an occasional pest in field tomatoes and peppers. We tend to see them when it's hot and dry. Otherwise, they tend to be kind of controlled by natural enemies. One good tip is to pay attention to what's happening in soybeans. So if you start to hear reports of spider mites in soybeans, be extra vigilant in vegetable crops, okay, because it means that they're around. Okay, so what we'll see with spider mite damage is this kind of stippling. So this will start off maybe as a few dots, okay, these kind of bleached little circles, and then they'll kind of blend together. Then you get a situation like this, okay, plus webbing, okay. The spider mites themselves are only about 1 millimeter in size, so they'll look like little specks running around, especially on the undersides of the leaves, okay. And they tend to start in a hot spot and then move out from there. So you can see how the front of this picture looks a little off, right? So that's spider mite damage, and then it will move out from there. Thank you very much. I'm just gonna get a quick drink.
It's a long time to talk.
I'm trying to talk really loud so that it picks up on the mic. Okay. So one thing, if you do have spider mites are present or confirmed, scout that area of the field last, and avoid spreading with between fields. So they will get on your clothes. You don't want to take them to the next stop, right? Okay. All right, stink bugs. So I'm going to talk about a few different stink bugs. Okay. Then I'll show you pictures of kind of typical damage. And there's also beneficial stink bugs. So we'll have one slide in here that talks briefly about how you can tell the difference between a plant feeding stink bug and predatory stink bugs. Okay. So this is one example of a brown stink bug, which can affect, which are one plant feeding pest, one species that can affect tomatoes and peppers. So these are the adults. Okay, so you recognize stink bugs by like that shield appearance on their back. Okay, and then the nymphal stages look similar to the adults. Okay, they live in a similar environment. Okay, but they don't have any functional wings. Okay, and I always think they kind of look kind of cute, like little babies. Okay. Green stink bug. Okay, here, and then the nymphs. Some examples there. Brown marmorated stink bug is a newer species in Ontario. You see here, this is just an example of the adult. Okay. And then Amanda was just saying at break, they're seeing a lot of one-spotted stink bug, which I don't actually have any pictures of. So I didn't know that until today. So with all these stink bugs, they have a piercing mouth, sucking mouth parts. So essentially what they're doing is they're inserting their mouth parts into the fruit and extracting food that way. And so this damages the tomato fruit and peppers. And it changes the color appearance on the exterior, but also the interior. And so when they're feeding on green fruit on the bottom, okay, you get these kind of blotchy appearances, which it's hard to really, doesn't show up on the screen that great, but hopefully in your printout. And then as the fruit ripens, you get kind of this snowflake appearance. okay? And then if you slice under that with a knife, there's a little bit of white there, okay? And then on a 15 on the red fruit, that's harder to see actually, okay, on the exterior, but underneath the peel, you have all this white discoloration. So in processing tomatoes, when that peel is removed, you have these white blotches, okay, that reduce the marketability. And you have a similar thing happening in peppers. So last year was a really bad year for stink bugs. They were all over the place. They are very hard to manage. They're also hard to monitor, okay? So I'm just gonna actually skip ahead to here and then I'll go backwards for monitoring. So these are monitoring guidelines for tomato out of Ohio. I'm not gonna read through all of these. Okay, it's fairly time intensive, okay, to have these, but these were what was developed out of Ohio. So you have to do 40 locations per field, put out a sheet in a tray, look at 10 fruit for damage, et cetera, et cetera. So not a lot of people have adopted this because it's so time consuming. Unfortunately, Amanda's been working on testing a new pheromone. So I think she's continuing that this summer. So hopefully things will progress and these will become easier to monitor in the future. With stink bugs, they're active in warmer temperatures, so greater than 21 degrees Celsius. They tend to move from weedy areas and other crops into the vegetables. So especially when winter wheat is harvested. So mid to late July, okay, that's when we start to see them show up, okay? There are also predatory stink bugs, okay, which are beneficial. And so there's this guide that's available online that's posted in the upper right-hand corner. So if you Google the title, you can download that whole guide as a PDF, okay? But what I highlighted out of that book here is looking at the beaks of predators versus pests, okay? So for the predator, okay, their mouth parts, okay, that beak is wider, okay, than the antennae, okay, you see here, versus on the plant feeding one, it's about the same width as the antennae. Okay, so those are kind of some of the key things to look at. If you see stink bugs in the field, it's not necessarily a bad one. Tarnished plant bugs are also something that you will likely observe when you're out and about. Okay, they are polyphagous, they have a really wide host range. They can cause similar damage in tomatoes and peppers as stink bugs. They have similar types of mouth parts. But research out of Ohio State has shown that they have a relatively low preference for tomato fruit. So it's likely stink bugs that are causing the bulk of the damage. All right, just got one slide here on aphids. So we can have aphids in tomatoes and peppers. They're relatively minor pests in the field, okay? There's several aphid species that could be present. They all have generally kind of a similar body shape of like a pear shape. And they will all have these typical cornicles protruding from the abdomen. These are like little tailpipes, okay? Other things you might see are aphid casts, okay, from their molts, these little white flecks. And you also might see aphid mummies. These are parasitized aphids that have been parasitized by parasitic wasps, okay? So that's a good thing to see. They also produce honeydew. So in some cases you might see honeydew on like a clear sticky substance that is secreted by the aphids. Sap beetles are another thing that you might see, particularly on overripe or rotting fruit. They're generally a secondary pest because you've got some other issue going on, like soft rot, for example. Okay, I think we've got pepper maggot and pepper weevil left. Okay, so pepper maggot. So pepper maggot, so you see eggs are deposited in the wall of the pepper fruit, okay? The larvae emerges and feeds within the fruit, okay? Then they produce an exit hole and pupate in the soil, okay? So creating wounding, setting them up for soft rot, okay? The larvae, okay, are a little over a centimeter long, okay, legless and white, okay? It is possible to monitor these with sticky traps and sweep nets. I think they're fairly sporadic, okay, and limited to kind of the southwest. All right, pepper weevil. And if you have any questions about pepper weevil, I'm gonna like direct you to Amanda because she actually knows way more about pepper weevil than I do. She's been monitoring them for like several years now. Okay, but pepper weevil. So pepper weevil have been really major pests in 2016 and 2017. Things have been more quiet in field peppers the last few years, which is good. Amanda's done a lot of surveys in field peppers in collaboration with the greenhouse industry as well. So hopefully it stays that way for 2022. So weevils are like typical, they have a typical weevil form, okay, where they've got this kind of snout, okay. With pepper weevil, they have like kind of a dark kind of or amber colored color, and this kind of triangle of white, okay, behind the head, okay. And you can see about like a little over half a centimeter tall, okay. This is the larval stage, they're legless, okay, and the pupal stage, okay. There's some examples here of oviposition marks. The calyx yellowing is a sign of mature larvae or pupae present. More oviposition marks, and then the adult exit hole, okay. This is a pretty serious pest and very difficult to control. So if you're scouting peppers, really be on the lookout for this. So what happens is the adult deposits the eggs in the well of the pepper fruit. Okay, then the larvae feed internally. So it's a great strategy because they're very hard to contact with insecticides once they're inside this nice protected place that has lots of food for them. They pupate inside, okay, and then the adult exits. So there's a bit more information here on the larvae side and the adults as well, okay. The adults can be confused with several other weevil species. And so if you are scouting these or suspect, okay, talk to Amanda for proper identification. There are some additional resources posted by OMAFRA that have really good like breakdown of like, no, it's like a different kind of different species of weevil. Some other indications. Okay, so the adults are very hard to find. Okay, so you're mostly going to see signs of the infestation. So inspect flowers and buds, see one here. Okay, new growth of young leaves, small dots on the foliage, okay, like you see right there. Okay, but they are hard to detect. There are sticky card plus a pheromone that can be used to monitor for pepper weevil. Okay, it's a 2-component pheromone, so you need both of these pheromones present. It works okay, but it attracts both males and females, and so there's lots of special instructions on where to put them in the field, how frequently you have to change the pheromone, all of that kind of stuff. So Amanda's been doing that for the last few years, and on behalf of, I guess, the growers or for growers. So, but if you are planning to do this yourself, like talk to Amanda to make sure you have everything set up properly, because it's probably a little bit more finicky than some of the other systems with pheromones where you just change it like every 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it says on the instructions and you're good to go. So I think that's it. That's all I have. So I can take any questions if there are any. If not, I think that Darren's up next. I can go grab them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions for Cheryl? Debbie, you can chat.
Okay. Do you want me to go grab Darren?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll get his stuff all set up for him then. Alrighty. We actually caught up some time there. I'm very, like, we're only 4 minutes behind now. We caught up a bit.
Okay, so here's the microphone for you.
I've sent you, that PDF I sent is like full size
Okay,
slides. I just sent it.
okay, I can share that with the group after
Yeah.
then.
Oh, it's got some.
See a little bit clearer.
And refer back to the field season.
Alrighty, so you should be all set. This is the clicker.
All right, so which one?
So the clicker's for the Zoom and then the keyboards for the,
Right, okay.
okay, sorry.
Oh, no.
I know it's confusing.
All right. Morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? All right. So guys, I'm going to talk to you about weed control in tomatoes and peppers. I know you guys are doing scouting, so I know you're not expected to do recommendations or anything like that. But the reason I go over weed control, there's two reasons. One is so that you know where the herbicide weaknesses are and what weeds could likely emerge as a result of their use. The other thing is the herbicide injury symptoms. The reason I'm doing the herbicide injury symptoms is because some of them look like disease or insect damage, right? Now, when you're looking at herbicide injury symptoms compared to the pattern of injury that you would see from an insect or a disease will be quite different, right? If it's a herbicide, you're going to see swaths down the entire length of the field. And if let's say they've made an application in one part of the field and they haven't, you're going to see a very, very definitive line of where the injury is, right? So that's going to tell you this is probably a herbicide that's been applied rather than insect damage. Okay, so that's the reason that I will talk about herbicides is for identification of the injury symptoms versus whether or not it's an insect or a disease, but also what weeds to look for. The other thing I'll do is I will talk about weed identification because that's the whole point of what you're going to be doing. I'll focus mostly on tomatoes. The weeds that we have in peppers, though, will be the same set of weeds. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do with the herbicides is talk about the pre-transplant set of herbicide treatments that growers are commonly using. All right. So I'm going to go through the three that you see in publication 75. The first one I'll talk about is just pre-plant incorporated dual plus Sencor. This is not very commonly used, guys. Like this is an unusual treatment where some growers will put the dual and all of the Sencor up front prior to transplanting. Usually what they do, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, is they'll put dual, a portion of the Sencor, and then the rest of the Sencor they'll apply as multiple microrate treatments to the tomatoes after the tomatoes have been planted. All right. It's unlikely you're going to find this particular situation, but I'll talk about it, just as well. So the main advantage, you get all your herbicide applied all at once, and it gives you pretty decent level of control, residual control through much of the year because all of the herbicide goes down when usually there's abundant moisture. And for these herbicides to work well and continue to control the weeds through the year, you need good soil moisture in the field. All right, so that's the primary advantage of it. The biggest concern with putting all of the herbicide down up front though, and especially if we have cool, wet weather like right now, man, I could see so much potential for injury in the next couple of weeks if growers are planting in these cool soils that we have where there's lots of available moisture, and especially if we get a big rainfall event, so more than 2 inches of rain, it can set back the transplants. All right, I have the comment here, low organic matter. Guys, the tomatoes are going to be growing on low organic matter. That's just the way that's just the production region that you're in. A lot of sandy soils where the organic matter is close to 2%, sometimes less than 2%. The biggest weakness of just using dual and Sencor is you're relying solely on the Sencor and to some limited degree the dual, but you're mostly relying on the Sencor for broadleaf weed control, okay? And Sencor, have you guys heard the herbicide groups? Just put up your hands if you've heard of herbicide groups. Okay, so it's a group 5. all over Ontario, mostly lamb's quarters. Okay, and to some degree pigweed, we have triazine resistant lamb's quarters. Sencor is not going to control it. And in fact, in almost every field that you're working in, some of those plants, some of the lamb's quarters are going to be resistant to triazine. Okay, so resistant to the Sencor. So you've got to use something else. And that's the main, that's another important reason. It's not the main. It's another important reason why growers typically don't use this strategy without something else. Okay, so if they do have a lot of triazine tolerant escapes, look to see if the only broadleaf herbicide that they've used is Sencor. All right, it's going to be your main escape. All right, so a little bit on the injury symptoms, guys. Dual injury. Dual injury. What you're looking for. Okay, what you're looking for is there's two main things that you're looking for. So the first thing you're going to see is some leaf distortion or some, it's almost going to look like curled up leaves.
There's a pointer on the that's here.
Right. Okay. So you're going to see a lot of curled up leaves. It's almost going to look like, you guys have heard of 2,4-D and dicamba that can drift. It's almost going to look like drift type injury. Okay. But what you'll notice with the dual is that you'll see it in the new young leaves. If it was 2,4-D or dicamba, you're going to see it all over the plant. Okay. So that'll be the main thing that you'll see. Another thing that you might get in some of the leaves, this is a little bit tricky, is that the midrib will shorten up and you'll get heart-shaped leaves. All right. So that's another potential injury symptom that's associated with dual. Right. The main time that, or the main factor that contributes to dual injury is cool, wet soil conditions, right? Typically, we see dual injury in the earlier planted tomatoes. You'll see it less in the later planted tomatoes, but if we get a cool spell, third week of May, the tomato plants will pick it up, right? So it's tied to weather. Okay, Sencor injury. What you're looking for with the Sencor injury is in the older leaves, right? You're not going to see this in the new leaves. You're going to see this in the older leaves. So the dual injury, you see that in the new leaves. Sencor, you're going to see it in the older leaves. And what you're looking for, it's called interveinal chlorosis. So it'll either turn the leaves, it depends on how bad the injury is. If it's yellow, the injury isn't so bad. If it looks white like this, and sometimes it does, it's bad, right? That's Sencor injury, and it'll turn the leaves white or yellow in between the leaf veins. All right, so the leaf veins you'll see will stay not all green, but portions of the leaf veins will stay green, and then you'll get that white or yellowing in between the leaf veins. Older leaves. Okay, Driftland Dual plus Sencor. There are a few growers who use this on the higher organic matter soils. They moved away from Treflan, and I'll show you why, just because there is concern with injury if the transplants are set really, really shallow, right? So one thing that you can look for is to see how deep the transplants have been set. And sometimes what'll happen is some of the transplants, just the top of the plug will be sticking up out of the top of the soil, and other ones get buried well. That's just because as the transplanters move through the field, there's small sections where maybe there's a bit of compaction, or it just hasn't gone, the transplant hasn't set properly. You can sometimes get uneven injury over the field in that situation, right? If there's either small little compacted areas or the transplanter just wasn't set quite properly. The benefit of having the Treflan there, in addition to the dual and the Sencor, Treflan is a group 3 herbicide. It helps out, and I will say helps out, not a lot, but it helps out early on with lamb's quarters, right? And pigweed control. It's not a triazine herbicide, right? So that's part of the reason why growers will use it, is to help out with controlling triazine resistant weeds. Again, where you're likely to see injury, it'd be sort of the same sort of weather conditions, cool, wet soils. But if the transplants aren't set very deep, The treflan will cause a lot of injury to the roots, and you'll get club rooting. So the roots, the tips of the roots will actually get swollen, and they'll look like little clubs. Okay. Probably the biggest thing that I notice in terms of weed escapes, if growers are using that three-way combination, is that some of the larger seeded broadleaf weeds won't be controlled. So in this picture here, do you guys know what this weed is? Right here, the big heart-shaped leaves. Yep, that's velvet leaf. Okay, so velvet leaf and common ragweed will be two weeds that are likely to escape this treatment. All right, they have bigger seeds, and the combination just doesn't work as well against them. So yeah, that's velvet leaf right on. Oh shoot, sorry guys. Okay, so injury from treflan. There's a couple of things that you're going to see if there's treflan. The main injury symptom you're going to get, so the plant that's here on the left or the plants that are on the left and the right have both been injured by treflan. The main symptom that you'll get in addition to that club rooting is just an overall reduction in the root system. The only way you're going to pick this up is if you dig up the entire plant, and make sure that you dig far enough away that you don't cut into the root system, right? So you want to dig up the whole plant. This plant in the middle is what they should look like, right? Like that's the extent of the growth on the plant. So always make sure that you dig up some healthy looking plants to compare, right? I mean, the root system might be more extensive than this. It depends on what the transplants came to you like. But the main thing that you'll notice if there's treflan injury is that basically the roots haven't grown from the extent that they were in the plugs when they got them, right? Sometimes you will get this, and I'm a little hesitant to show this. Sometimes you'll get purpling of the leaves, all right? Why do you think you've got that leaf purple? What other, okay, man? Nutrient deficiency. What nutrient deficiency causes purpling? Yeah. Phosphorus, right? That reduction in root growth, if you have cool, wet conditions, can result in purpling that's due to its inability to take up phosphorus. Treflan doesn't do that, right? So sometimes the treflan injury will not correspond with purpling. It's not the treflan that causes it. It is a nutrient deficiency. All right. And again, it's tied to depth of transplanting. So this graph at first might be a little bit funny to look at. And this was actually an experiment where the intent was not to look at treflan injury, but it worked out that way. So what you see here is the bigger the bar, the more the percentage yield loss as a percentage of the untreated check. So a bigger bar is bad. All right, and what they did was they transplanted the plants at 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch, and 4 inches depth. So basically the top of the plug, for the 4 inches, that's hard. Like they had to get that plant way, way down. So they set the transplants basically at the soil surface and then at subsequent depths. And they applied Treflan Dual and Sencor over the whole trial. And it was this was not a weed control trial. This was a transplanting depth trial. And man, did they ever show the effect of transplanting depth on sensitivity of tomatoes to treflan, right? So that's, again, something to look for. If you see a lot of some club rooting injury, if you see transplants that are maybe having that purpling, dig up some plants, look for the injury symptoms, but it will be associated with the depth of transplant. This is what most growers do, guys. Most growers will put down Dual and Sencor, and they'll come in with microrates of Sencor post-emergence. They may have another herbicide along with it, along with those post-emergence applications of Sencor, and I'll talk a bit about those. Okay, but this is sort of their foundation, and then from there, they work on. All right. The biggest advantage that we see is, first off, we pick up on those larger seeded broadleaf weeds like velvet leaf and ragweed. We get better control. Second, because there's less herbicide there at transplanting time when the transplants are young and kind of
well, not really vulnerable, but they're a bit more vulnerable to injury. We get less injury when we split up those applications. All right, you still have to do something about triazine resistant lamb spurs. The dual will give you a little bit of suppression, but it's not enough, okay? So you're still going to get triazine resistant weeds. Growers they're kind of used to making multiple applications because of their fungicide sprays, right? And this is where you might want to be careful with the injury that you're seeing. Say, I'll talk about post-emergence herbicides, is that sometimes they will tank mix herbicide and a fungicide together so they can reduce their number of passes across the field. That can sometimes really heat up the herbicide, all right? So be mindful of that. If the insecticide, it's especially with insecticides, if the insecticide that they're using is an emulsifiable concentrate, what that EC does is it helps increase the uptake of the herbicide, and you can get accentuated herbicide injury, right? So if they're tank mixing a herbicide with an insecticide and maybe with a fungicide too, you got to check the fungicide as well. You can sometimes get more injury from the herbicide if the insecticide or fungicide that was sprayed along with it is an emulsifiable concentrate, right? Because what the EC does is basically, it doesn't dissolve the cuticle, but it does emulsify the cuticle. That's the whole damn point of an EC, okay? Is to help break down that cuticular layer, emulsify the cuticular layer. Okay. All right, so all I'm showing here is some nice pictures of weed control that I've done in trials. It is a really effective way to control weeds. One thing though that is critical for this program to work is the size of the weeds that need to be targeted with those microrate applications. Guys, it's small. Okay, some growers will use microrates they'll use higher rates in their microrates because of this. And especially, like, let's say you've got your pre-transplants down, things are going really well, there's good moisture in the soil at the time, but then we get like a late May or early June rainfall, and like it's a heavy rainfall where we can't get into the field for a week or so. Those weeds are going to grow on us during that time, right? So we have to really keep on top of scouting weeds before that happens. And, you know, sometimes, like, if you were to see this in the field, you don't see them. You do not see them from the truck, all right? You have to get into the field. You have to get really, really close to see weeds that are this size. But for those microrates to work well, this is the optimal time. Oh, guys, that's really small. Okay, that's the optimal size for those microrate applications. And if they've gone past this, it's the best recommendation. Now, again, you're not going to be doing recommendation, but the best thing that they can do is to increase the rate of their microrate treatment, or to add another post-emergence herbicide along with it, which I'll talk about in a bit. Okay, guys, just a little bit of data here. You know, you can take it for what it's worth. What I did was I compared, you can't see the third set of bars because it's black. I've got the 3 different treatment programs there. The blue bars are what we aim for, right? So that's the dual plus Sencor followed by the 3 microrates of Sencor. If you could see the white bars, what you would see, especially here for velvet leaf, okay, and also to some degree for the lamb's quarters and pigweed, but mostly what you would see with the velvet leaf is that it would be about the same length as the orange bar. It's about 40 to 45% control. It's just not enough, right? Right. The blue bars, the reason that we use dual plus Sencor followed by microrates is that year after year, and again, this data set that I'm showing you is based on about 12 years worth of data. It's just the most consistent way to control broadleaf weeds in tomatoes. Okay, so the best way to control broadleaf weeds in tomatoes, dual plus Sencor followed by those Sencor microrates. right? Dual and Sencor by itself, all up front. And even Treflan plus Dual plus Sencor, this should say Treflan plus Dual plus Sencor, just aren't consistent enough for the weeds that we deal with in our tomato growing region. Okay, so what have growers added to this? So what I'm showing you are a few herbicides that have been registered in slightly more recent future. So since I've come to Ridgetown, and they're there to help out with a few specific weed problems that we have, right? So Authority 480 is a herbicide that it's more and more growers are using Authority 480. It's a really, really good product for controlling Eastern black nightshade. That's probably the main reason guys are going to use it, is because it will help out with Eastern black nightshade. If you're going to use Authority, you've got to use it prior to transplanting with your Dual and with your Sen, right? That's how it's going to work. It's a group 14 herbicide. It will also control triazine resistant redroot pigweed and lambsworms. So it can help out there too. If you see a field that has really, really good Eastern black nightshade control, and you will see some of them, likely they've included Authority in with their pre-transplant treatment. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here are a little bit of research slides. This is stuff that we did before getting Authority registered, right, to make sure that we had enough tolerance in tomatoes to get that registration. So showing you here Authority by itself, it was fine. Then what we did was we envisioned the way that growers would use it based on its strengths and how it would fit in with what growers were currently using. And we see across most fields, excellent tolerance, right? So that's all I'm trying to show you here, is that the tomatoes look fine with that three-way tank mix. But what you have to be careful of is on soils that have low organic matter, so less than 2% organic matter, and low cation exchange capacity, all right? So Authority is a positively charged ion when it's in the soil, it's a cation. Cation exchange sites will bind it, okay? If you have low CEC, less than 8, it's more biologically available, and it can cause significant injury to tomatoes that leads to yield loss, right? So that's like 25% injury in tomatoes. Woo, that's really bad, guys. Like, this is something where the growers look at this and it's unacceptable, all right? This is what can happen in a soil that has low organic matter, and you can see right next to it, I've got Dual plus Sencor, right? That's the three-way combination of Dual, Authority plus Sencor. You'll get massive swaths in a field where the tomatoes will either be completely taken out or just almost completely dead. Okay, so I did include, I added some additional pictures, guys. Now, the one picture that I've got is Authority on peppers. You shouldn't see that because that's not registered. But the reason I've got this picture is I don't have a better picture of Authority injury on tomatoes, and the two look the same, okay? So what you're looking for, first off, is you'll get small little brown spots, small little necrotic lesions on the leaves, okay? You will get leaf crinkling. It'll look like Dual injury, guys, right? So that leaf puckering or leaf crinkling on the leaf surface. And you'll also get the midribs will be shortened, so you'll get leaves that look heart-shaped. But the giveaway is those necrotic lesions, right? The little brown, they won't turn black, but there'll be little brown spots on the leaf surface, along with the leaf crinkling and the shortening of the midribs. Okay, so again, you should not see this injury in any pepper field. If you do, they've done something they shouldn't have, okay? But the injury in tomatoes will look like that. Oh, geez, okay. And like I said, unfortunately, you can't see all the numbers here because the graph isn't there, but you'll get anywhere from a 20 to 35% yield reduction if you get that type of injury with Authority, right? 20 to 35% yield reduction. And again, we see it in low organic matter soils, less than 2%, low CEC soils, less than 8. Okay, another product that was somewhat recently registered is Prowl H2O. Prowl is, it's taking over from Treflan. It's very similar in its chemistry. It has the same sort of weed spectrum that it controls. It's a bit less injurious to tomatoes though, all right? So Prowl might cost a bit more than Treflan, but it's safer on tomatoes. It's primarily there for annual grasses. And the biggest benefit that we see in tomato production systems is control of crabgrass, right? Especially for those tomato growers that are growing seed corn in rotation with tomatoes, and you will be dealing with a number of them, right? With seed corn, what happens, you know, they open up the canopy sort of midsummer. That opening up of the canopy allows a whole bunch of crabgrass to germinate and emerge in the seed corn that usually doesn't get controlled set seed. So the next year when you're growing tomatoes, you've got a ton of crabgrass in, all right? So it's part of the production system. It's part of the production system. Prowl does have a fit there, right? So you use it in your tomatoes to help out with crabgrass control. Dual 2 Magnum is not as good, right? I've been talking about Dual 2 Magnum with Sencor. Dual is your main grass control, grass herbicide. It is not as good on crabgrass as Prowl. Okay, so I have some big graphs here, guys. I was asked this question here: what if we tank mix Authority with Prowl and Sencor instead of Authority with Dual and Sencor? Are we going to get effective control of the spectrum of weeds that we have? All right, and basically the weeds that they were most concerned about would be crabgrass, lamb's quarters, pigweed, eastern black nightshade. And all I'm trying to show you here, guys, I'll just direct your attention to the very top bar, this sort of dark gray bar, right? With the 3-way tank mix of Authority plus Prowl plus Sencor. And we do have some micro-rate treatments that come in post-emergence after this. We're getting effective control of those important broadleaf weeds as well as crabgrass, right? So the simple answer to their question was yes, right? Prowl can be put in place of Dual in that instance, okay? There is a but, and I'm gonna come to that, not on this slide, but in the next slide, okay? So Authority plus Prowl and Sencor, another concern is, and this is a legitimate concern, would it result in increased level of injury compared to having the Dual in there, right? In all the work that we've done, the injury was less than 10% unless we were working on a low organic matter, low CEC soil. And in that case, it's the Authority that's causing the injury. It's not the Prowl, right? But as long as we're working on a soil where we have above 2% organic matter and above 8 CEC, this 3-way tank mix is safe on tomatoes. Okay, where I think we're going to miss out, I don't think we're going to miss out on too many of the larger seeded weeds out there like velvet leaf, but we do notice a bit less control of ragweed, right? And that's simply because Authority is not strong on ragweed. Authority is weak on ragweed. So 85% control is good, but it's not strong. Right? We don't see any delay in maturity. We don't see any injury. We don't see any impact on yield. But if the grower has really, really heavy eastern black nightshade, I would say to use Dual instead of Prowl. Dual 2 Magnum is better on eastern black nightshade than Prowl. Right? So it is a good 3-way tank mix, but we lose control of eastern black nightshade. All right, guys, so a little bit of weed ID. And I won't take too long with this, but I want you guys to have these pictures, and I've sent a PDF of this file, which Amanda is going to email to you, of full page slides, not the little, like you guys have the slides with the little slide and the lines. That's no good. You need a big picture, and it's all in color, okay? So what you're looking for with these different weeds, the cotyledons and the presence or absence of hairs and other structures on, Okay, so with lamb's quarters, what you're looking for are these elongate oval cotyledons. Okay, oval leaves. And then if it's lamb's quarters, it'll always have this white, it almost looks like a mealy powder, this little white powder, or sometimes it's light gray color on the surface of the leaves. Okay, so that's lamb's quarters. Okay, guys, common ragweed is super easy to identify even in the cotyledon stage, right? It has small little round cotyledons. And if you're not sure, it's fun to do. Well, okay, I think it's fun to do. Take the cotyledon, flip it over. You'll see little tiny black marks all around the periphery of the underside of the cotyledon, all right? So if you flip the cotyledon over, you just see little tiny black marks at the edge of the periphery of the cotyledon, all the way around, right? That's common ragweed. Okay, once you see the first true leaves, you should be able to identify it, right? It's got those fern-like leaves, and there are hairs on the leaves. Okay, I think you guys will get velvet leaf. Velvet leaf has got heart-shaped cotyledons, okay? Sometimes one of the cotyledons is a little bit less heart-shaped and more sort of rounded with a bit of an indentation than the other cotyledons. So sometimes the two cotyledons are not exactly the same shape, right? There are very, very soft velvety hairs on the stems and on the petioles, right? It's easy to ID them by those hairs there. And then the first couple of leaves will be a little bit more oval. They get more heart-shaped as the plant gets bigger. Okay. But that's velvet leaf. Okay. So this is red root pigweed, and another, I'm going to talk about this second picture here in a little bit. This is red root pigweed. It is widely spread throughout Ontario, including the growing area that you're in. Okay, again, what you're looking for are these elongate oval cotyledons. Actually, the cotyledons look a heck of a lot like lamb's quarters, right? But there are hairs, especially on the upper portion of the stem and the petioles. So the leaf stalks. Okay, so you will see hairs on the leaf stalks. And then the other thing you'll notice about pigweed leaves, okay, is that there's a small little notch or small little indentation in the tips of those leaves. Right, that's red root pigweed. The picture that I printed out, I think is better than the picture I have on the slide. This is red root pigweed and water hemp. Okay, any of you working with Nikki Taylor? Okay, so she asked me a couple of years about water hemp. We are starting to see more and more water hemp in tomato fields, okay? The easiest way to tell red root pigweed and water hemp apart, I think you should look for two things, but the easiest way is by the shape and size of the cotyledons, okay? So the cotyledon of red root pigweed is more elongate. It's oval in water hemp. Okay. Then the second thing to do, and make sure you have your hand lens, look for the presence or absence of hairs. There's no hairs on water hemp, none at all. Okay. If there's hairs, it's red root pigweed. So the shape of the cotyledons and the presence or absence of hairs. All right, this is Eastern Black Nightshade. I tell you guys that I'd be able to identify them when they're cotyledons. Well, with Eastern Black Nightshade, we don't have any post-emergence herbicides. There isn't anything that a grower can do about it, right? So if you see this, they're going to have to go in and mechanically control it. There's nothing that you can do. Okay, so in terms of identifying Eastern Black Nightshade when it emerges, okay, it has oval cotyledons and oval leaves. And the leaves are covered with hairs. You need a hand lens to see them, but the leaves are covered with hairs. Right? Red root pigweed does not have hairs on the surface of the leaves. The reason I'm pointing that out is sometimes the cotyledons aren't as long as they are in red root pigweed, but it may look a little bit like a water hemp seedling, right? But it has hairs on the surface of the leaf. Another thing you can do with Eastern Black Nightshade, flip the leaf over. On the bottom of the leaf, you'll see like a dark purple or sometimes even black color on the bottom of the leaf. Okay, that's Eastern Black Nightshade. Okay, hairy nightshade does also look like, it looks a little bit like Eastern Black Nightshade. It does look a little bit like redroot pigweed plant in that it has these elongate oval cotyledons, okay, and it has oval leaves. There's not a little notch in the tip of the leaf like there is in redroot pigweed. And hairy nightshade does have hairs on the surface of the leaves and on the cotyledons. Okay, so guys, presence or absence of hairs on these different structures is really, really helpful to picking these plants out. Okay, so presence of hairs on the cotyledons and the leaves in hairy nightshade. The cotyledons, though, will look more like redroot pigweed cotyledon. They'll be more elongate oval. This is how small it is. This is the stage or the size that it has to be for a grower to get effective control with Prism. Prism is the main herbicide that they're going to use to control it. You can add some Sencor to get better control. Like Sencor will help out the Prism. I think what actually the Sencor is doing is there's an adjuvant that's built into the Sencor. I think it's helping take with the uptake of Prism. I don't think the Sencor is not good on Prism, hairy nightshade at all. I mean, we may as well just be watering it. But I do think that the adjuvant in the Sencor helps it out. Okay, so you can tell this is an old, super old picture because this is from a camera that took like pictures. It's really old. Okay, and I thought you guys might like this too. This is sort of when these weeds are going to be starting to germinate and emerge, right? So just, I mean, what I like to do with the students in one of my classes is have them expand this chart out with other weed species, right? So that you know when they're going to emerge, germinate and emerge, right? So lamb's quarters and ragweed, they're up right now, right? For sure, and they've probably been up for a couple of weeks, even though it's cold. Woo, right? Velvet leaf and redroot pigweed tend to germinate through the month of May and into the start of June. The nightshades are a bit later, like starting in mid-May. Okay, so post-emergence herbicides. Again, all I'm doing here, what for your sake, I think is to know what the injury looks like so that you can piece it apart from injury that's caused by insects and diseases. All right, so there's three main herbicides that are used post-emergence that have potential to cause injury in tomatoes. That's Sencor, Pinnacle, and Prism. Okay, Sencor, again, that's part of the mycorrhiza strategy. It's for general broadleaf weed control. Pinnacle and Prism are very selective, and they have there's some key weed species that growers use. Okay, so with Pinnacle, they're mostly going after lamb's quarters that are resistant to Sencor, but also pigweed. Okay, Prism is actually good on pigweed too, guys. Prism is used for the control of hairy nightshade. Right, so if they're using these herbicides, that's what they're using for. Often what growers will do with Prism is they will add one of their Sencor mycorrhizas, although what they'll do is they'll add Prism to one of their Sencor mycorrhiza treatments. Okay. So this is why Pinnacle got registered. Okay, this is Frank Furland's field, just outside of Chatham. This was the type of lamb's quarters pressure that he had in his field. Whoa, look at that. Oh my gosh. It was just absolutely terrible. Pinnacle is really good on lamb's quarters. Like it'll take down lamb's quarters that are 20, 30 centimeters tall. Okay, so awesome herbicide for control of triazine resistant lamb's quarters, but there are some concerns around injury, right? One of them is cultivar tolerance. There are some tomato cultivars, like look at that. Ooh, that's okay. There are some cultivars that are sensitive to pinnacle. Okay, what the processors have done with the growers, they give them a list of different cultivars that they're going to be growing through the summertime. They will tell them which are sensitive and which are tolerant to pinnacle. Right? So they shouldn't be making this mistake, but sometimes this just happens, right? If there's an applicator that's in a rush, this can potentially happen. The type of injury that you'll get within a couple of days, the tomato plants will start to droop, maybe even with a day of application. It'll look like they're wilting from drought stress. And then you'll get yellowing in the new growing tissues. If this happens, these plants are not going to recover. Okay, it's too much. Okay. So some of the things, some other observations that I've made about pinnacle, all right, we go up to 3.2 grams per acre. It's used for controlling triazine resistant lamb's quarters and pigweed, right? If you don't need to use, like if you don't have a real problem with triazine resistant lamb's quarters, then I would suggest to a grower not to use pinnacle, right? It's kind of a last resort unless they absolutely have to do it. Okay, I also don't recommend using it along with Sencor, right? I made the comment that often Prism gets included with one of those microrate treatments, right? Prism and Sencor together, we see pretty good tolerance in tomatoes. Pinnacle and Sencor, I've seen as often as not, I've seen injury in tomatoes. Okay, it's most likely to cause injury in tomatoes if we apply it in the middle of the afternoon when we get above 32 degrees Celsius. And it can cause injury if it's applied real early to frost injured plants that haven't had a chance to recover from that frost injury. Okay, and again, we do have that cultivar or variety sensitivity. I think the industry has a pretty good handle on it. The processing industry has a pretty good handle on which cultivars you can and should not be using pinnacle on. Okay, but like I said, even in really hot weather, a cultivar that should not be affected by it you'll get some, and this was the next day. The grower called me up, he's like, Darren, look, please come out and take a look. So this guy was just outside of Wheatley. Some of you might be working with Jim Brush, and he had done everything. He thought he had done everything right. Unfortunately, it got really, really hot that afternoon, and this is what happened. Now, I kept an eye on it. The plants didn't stop growing, right? The plants continued to grow. And when I went back a week later, you would not have known, right? You would not have known. So the plants did outgrow that. All right, so this was part of a presentation that I did for the growers about 6 or 7 years ago. I've included it in this talk just because I think it's relevant to some of the situations you might be in. If the temperatures are going to get really hot though, what is the best way to do this? And I suggest wait until the evening, wait until those hot temperatures have passed to apply the pinnacle. All right, so it's safest if we wait until at least after 4:30 in the afternoon. It's all associated with temperatures though at the time of application. Sometimes even at 4:30, it can be 32 degrees Celsius. So wait until it cools off. Okay, so when temperatures drop down below 29 degrees Celsius. Okay, prism injury. Until I had been here 17 years, I'd never seen prism injure tomatoes except in a few growers' fields where it was around the edges of the field and there was probably an overlap, right? Like often you'll get slight parts of the field around the edges where they spray up one way on the headlands here, and then they finish up, and you know, in a corner section of the field, it gets a double spray of prism. In 2017, though, I saw significant prism injury. It was late, or sorry, it wasn't late. It was in the middle of the afternoon. It was really, really hot out. Sencor was included along with it. And I do think these plants were under some dry, not drought, but it had been fairly dry. So there is some potential for prism to cause injury. What I did notice though, in all the work that I did not see any sort of delay in growth. The plants recovered and I did not see a yield reduction. Right? It is possible to get some prism injury, especially if we have the prism being applied in really, really hot weather. And I think again, there's an overspray. Okay. I don't think you guys are going to get these questions, but just so that you know, there are some other post-emergence herbicides out there, right? And what I'm showing you here are slides. These are based on actual questions that I've gotten emails from either growers or people working at retail outlets, right? About some of the other herbicides that are available. So Sandia is another herbicide that is available for use. We have this issue with triazine-resistant lamb's quarters. The question was, how big can lamb's quarters get before Sandia will do anything, right? Sandia is actually not very good on lamb's quarters at all, right? So don't rely on it for post-emergence control of lamb's quarters. Okay, will Sandia control hairy nightshade? Right. It's a group 2 herbicide, just like Prism, so its chemistry is similar. It will not control hairy nightshade, right? I don't think you're going to come across this situation where a grower says, hey, you know what, I sprayed this herbicide, I thought it was going to work. I don't know if this will happen, but just so that you guys know, Sandia does not control hairy nightshade. Prism does, right? And that's despite the fact that they're very similar herbicides. Sandia is very good on common rag, right? So it does an excellent job of controlling common rag. If a grower applies Sandia, and the common ragweed is not controlled, then you have group 2 resistant common rag, right? Sandia is excellent on ragweed, but it is a group 2 herbicide. There are some populations of common ragweed that are resistant to it. Okay, last thing I'll talk about are problem grass weeds. The main weeds that you'll encounter will be the crabgrasses. There's foxtail in almost every field. The herbicides that we use for controlling the foxtails in tomatoes are pretty good, right? We usually don't have to worry about them. Fall panicum can be an issue just because it can germinate and emerge throughout the summer, right? So late germinating fall panicum can be an issue in so like the tomatoes that are longer season tomatoes. Okay, so I talked earlier about seed corn tomato rotations, and when we open up the canopy in the middle of the summer, it will allow for new flushes of crabgrass to emerge, right? And they will set seed. That will cause an issue in tomatoes, right? So I don't know if you're working with, you probably will be, some of you. If you're working with growers that have both seed corn and tomatoes, make sure they do an awesome job of controlling crabgrass in their seed. Okay, crabgrasses, how to identify the crabgrasses. Crabgrasses have a membranous ligule. Okay, show of hands. You guys know what I mean when I say ligule. Okay, so ligule is this small little piece of tissue here that we find at the base of the leaf. We call it membranous. It's just a solid membrane of tissue. Okay, there's 2 types of crabgrass. Smooth crabgrass is mostly smooth. You might see some hairs here at the base of the leaf around the ligule. Large crabgrass is also called hairy crabgrass. It has hairs all over the leaves. Okay. Prism as a post-emergence herbicide is pretty good on most of the annual grasses that you're going to have to deal with. It's a really good annual grass herbicide. It was actually registered in corn decades ago, so before you guys were born, as a limb for control of quackgrass in corn. It's an awesome grass herbicide, even though we use it for hairy nightshade in tomatoes. There is one weakness though. Prism is not good on crabgrass. Oh, we just went over this. Crabgrass being a major weed issue. Crabgrass is well controlled by Venture and Post Ultra in tomatoes. So those are going to be your best options for crabgrass control. Okay, just a little bit about what they look like. Again, for the foxtails, what you're looking at in terms of the ligule The ligule is a small little line or fringe of hairs. Okay, so you'll see a fringe of hairs here instead of a solid piece of tissue. And yellow foxtail will have wispy hairs, like maybe 3/4 of an inch long or 1.5 centimeters long. At the like, look at the base of the leaf blade, about the bottom couple of inches of the base of the leaf blade. That's yellow foxtail. Okay, giant foxtail. This is the easiest way to ID it. Take the leaf blade, hold it up to the sun, so you've got some light behind it. You'll see hairs on one side of the leaf blade, and the bottom, well, I shouldn't say the bottom because it depends on which way you turn it, but one side of the leaf blade will have hairs, the other side of the leaf blade will not have hairs. And again, the ligule is a fringe of hairs. Okay. Green foxtail, you will see the ligule, again, just a line of hairs. The only other place that you'll see hairs on green foxtail, and you'll need a hand lens to see this, is a small little line of hairs, okay, along the edge of each side of the leaf sheath. Okay. You're not going to see them on the leaf blade. You can feel them. They're short, little rough hairs. You're not going to see them. You won't see those hairs up on the leaf blade. Okay, but on the leaf sheath, you will see a small little line of hairs along each edge of the leaf sheath. Okay, fall panicum does look a lot like green foxtail when it's, say, like 2-3 leaf stage. Okay, so the reason we think it is because there's no hairs, the ligule is a small little line of hairs. You will see some hairs on the base of the leaf blade that you don't see in green foxtail. And you do not see any hairs along the margins of the leaf sheath. Okay, so green foxtail has hairs along the margins of the leaf sheath. Fall panicum, you will see some hairs up here on the base of the leaf blade and none along the leaf sheath. Okay, so that's why I put this picture here together. Okay, green foxtail is on the left here. Fall panicum is on the right. They do look very similar, except green foxtail has hairs on the margins of the leaf sheath. Fall panicum does not. Fall panicum will have some hairs here at the base of the leaf blade. Okay, in terms of control of the sort of like groups of grass weeds, so I have the foxtails grouped separately from all the other grasses. Venture is very good for barnyard grass, witchgrass, fall panicum. It is a bit weaker though on the foxtails than post alter. So if you have, let's say you have a mix of barnyard grass, witchgrass, and foxtail, your better option would be to go with post alter. If you don't have foxtails, that would be unusual. If you don't have foxtails, price it out, right? The best price is if the best price is venture, then you go with it. Venture is a little bit weaker on the foxtails. Okay, I talked about prism and annual grass control. And remember I showed you the slide with crabgrass. Another weakness with prism is yellow foxtail. Okay, so prism, excellent for most grasses except crabgrass and yellow foxtail. Okay, some growers are using post-emergence applications of dual, right? What they're trying to do is extend the control of grasses and also eastern black nightshade through the year. The main concern that I would have is if that post-emergence application happens during say a cool period late in May or early in June. It is possible to get some injury from a post-emergence application of dual. And it's going to look like that picture I showed you earlier, right? Where the leaves are curled up, you'll get the shortening of the midrib, right? And you'll see that on the newer leaves. And you can get this too, guys. Side by side, so this is the same cultivar on either side of the field here. They did a post-emergence application of dual on one side and not on the other. And you can see right to the line where the dual was applied. So it does cause some yellowing of the tomatoes too. That was really apparent in this case. Right? Again, remember I talked about the pattern? That's herbicide pattern, right? Just right to the line where it's sprayed. Okay, and again, this is what that dual injury looks like when you get a close-in look. You see the leaf puckering or the shortening of the midrib or the curled up leaves. Okay, I did go back to the field about a week later. I was amazed at how well those plants came out of it. The plants really did outgrow the injury, but you could still see, I could still see the older leaves were showing some of the puckering and the shortening, the drawstringing, it's sometimes called, shortening of the midrib was still there. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about peppers. You know, the weed spectrum is mostly the same. We have a couple of different herbicides. So we've already talked about Treflan. Again, with Treflan, you can get that club rooting type injury, right, of the roots. And if it's really cool and wet, you can also see some of the purpling in peppers. Devernol will sometimes cause stunting in peppers. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. Dual 2 Magnum will cause the same sort of injury that I showed you in the tomatoes, right? So the right, the leaf puckering, shortening of the midrib, and leaf curling, you'll get the same thing in peppers. Okay, and then Command. Command is a bleacher. It will turn plants white, just like paper. Okay, so the picture, the third image that I have here, this is Dual and Command injury together. It's not Command by itself. And usually this is what you're going to get because growers typically will use a tank mix of Dual and Command if they're going to. So you get the bleaching, right? You will also see the leaf crinkling, and also you can get the drawstringing. So this one leaf here, it's not completely heart-shaped, but definitely the tip of the leaf has been pulled in because that midrib has been shortened. Okay, so Devernol in really sandy soils, Devernol brings a lot for lamb's quarters control. This is a picture, I took these pictures down at the Simcoe research station, right, where they have low organic matter. Devernol can work really, really well on lamb's quarters. As you can see, Dual does not. Okay. But this here, so the Dual with the Devernol looked fine. The Dual with the Dacthal can cause quite a bit of injury. Dacthal is a really old herbicide. Okay. Along with stunting, what you're going to get is some misshapen leaves. It's going to look almost like group 4 injury. So you'll get some like leaf curling, what looks like drift injury. So that's from the Dacthal. Okay. We don't want to do this. I do this just because it's better for me to do it than for growers to do it. But putting different combinations of herbicides together underneath plastic can cause quite a bit of injury. Or if we put down a herbicide and then we put down the plastic and then transplant into the plastic and apply Sandia over top of the plastic. What'll happen is the Sandia will basically funnel into the openings, the transplant openings, and you'll get significant injury from that. Okay, so I don't know if you guys have any guys who are using peppers, growing peppers on plastic, but if you do, you have to be really careful of herbicides that are applied after the plastic has been laid down. If that herbicide collects and pools in the transplant holes, it can cause quite a bit of injury. Okay, the last thing I'll talk about are drift injury, is a little bit of drift injury. So talk about sort of the different patterns of drift that I've seen over time and the main herbicides that you would be looking for. So probably one of the hardest to diagnose is when we get gusting wind conditions, because what you'll notice in a field, you'll get almost like waves in a field where the herbicide gusted more than it did at other times. So this Like that, you can't see it here, but the herbicide had been applied in a field that was on the other side of the road. The wind was gusting that day, and you could see, like in some cases, it went almost halfway up the length of the field. And in other cases, you'll see transplants adjacent to it that aren't affected by the injury at all, right? So this is just a pattern of injury that I'm trying to show you. Sometimes you'll see little crescent moons, right? So in this case here, the grower turned around and he got a little bit too close at this one edge, and it's not really drift, right? That's not really drift. He left his sprayer on as he was turning around, and you got that little crescent moon of injury. These plants completely died. This was Roundup Ready soybeans. The grower applied Roundup, and it killed those tomatoes. Again, this, I shouldn't call it drift because it's not drift. Okay, and then the types of herbicides that will cause injury. Do you guys know what herbicide, have an idea what type of herbicide would cause this? Grip 4. So this is dicamba injury in tomatoes. 2,4-D will do the same thing. Distinct will do this as well. Right, so you'll get like the leaf curling, and then it's called epinasty, where the stems will twist, right? So if you ever hear anyone, well, usually it's just us weed scientists, guys. It's called epinasty. It's just twisting of the stems. Okay, guys, glyphosate drift in tomatoes often will cause yellowing, but sometimes will cause sometimes it's referred to as the hearts of the plant, but the brand new leaf growth to turn almost white, right? So what you would notice before you would see this whitening is the plants, just they look like they stopped growing for like 3 or 4 days. Weather conditions are perfect for growth, right? There's good moisture, but the plants will just look like they've stopped growing. And then you'll see this white flash in the heart of the plants. Okay, usually glyphosate causes this yellowing, right? Usually it causes yellowing, but I have seen that white flash also that's caused by glyphosate drift. Okay, and another thing that you'll notice along with the yellowing is you can get some leaf distortion, like some leaf puckering as well. Okay, so this is also glyphosate drift. Okay, guys, so these are some links here just to some of the images that I've got in this presentation. And then the herbicide efficacy, it's a table that has the herbicides and the weeds. I mean, like I said, you're not giving recommendations, but if you know where herbicides are weak, and if a herbicide has been applied, it can help you sort of piece out why it is we have this weed here when herbicide application has been made. Okay. All right.
Are there any questions in the chat there?
Oh, geez. I bet there are. I haven't.
Let's just, is there any questions in
Yeah, do you
person?
guys
And
have
I'll
any
check the
questions?
chat here.
Okay.
Any questions? Okay, let's check the chat. Oh.
Yeah, so someone said phosphorus.
Yeah. How effective is microrate on common purslane?
Not so effective, Paul. Yeah. Yeah, the Sencor microrates are not very effective on person.
And all of the photos that Darren showed here in person, I'll make sure to send that out to the group when I have the recording and everything
Okay.
sent out to.
Yeah,
Okay?
what I did was the PDF that I sent you is updated with these images here.
Okay.
Like some of them weren't in the presentation when I sent it to you the first time.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll take that microphone. So we're gonna have Anne Verhalen coming next, but she's going to be joining us virtually. So just let me get set up here for the in-person stuff. Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Darren. I really appreciate it.
Have a fun summer, guys.
It
I know it's really late. It's like, oh,
sounds like it's gonna be a hot one too.
it's well. and
Okay, sorry.
everything's gonna go crazy too. Like scouting is gonna be so difficult because these weeds that I've shown you that you should be scouting for, like a lot of times, most cases, they'll work the field. So some of those early emerging ones are not going to be there when you expect them to be there. And they're going to be emerging at the same time as some of them, like the mid to late May. Right? So it's going to condense all of your scouting.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask all of the people that are in person to get cozy and bring your chairs up to the front for this one. Because of those technical difficulties that we experienced this morning, you will not be able to see Anne's presentation on the large screen. So Anne's gonna take over here. If you guys wanna come up and have a look, see? And then to Gender, do you wanna bring your presentation up and I'll explain to you kind of what's going on here. So thank you, Anne. Take it away.
Okay, can you hear me?
Let's turn the volume on, Anne.
Sorry?
I'm turning up the volume, that's all.
Okay. My apologies for not being there in person. My plan had been, but I'm in COVID jail, so I'm stuck at home right now. And for those of you who were on the intro to IPM, some of these slides will look very similar because they are the same, with a few little changes for tomatoes. So let's go through this. So the soil is an important part of scouting too, and it can tell you a story, and along with the soil, of course, the crop and its roots. So when we're in the field, we can get a lot from just field observation. And I'm going to talk about soil profiles, we'll talk about texture, drainage, infiltration, and a little bit about compaction. When we start looking at the diagnostic things that we can send to the lab, that's fertility. I think Gender's talking about that a little bit more, and pH. Of course, EC or salts. And don't forget, we are starting to see road salt damage in some locations within the province. Haven't heard a lot with tomatoes in this immediate area, but I do know of some people in Norfolk, if they're on a corner of a couple of county roads, there just seems to be a lot of salt use, and we're starting to see some more of that. And then of course, nematodes. So the thing with the infield diagnostics with soil profiles is our landscape is not consistent. If you think of any of the tomato fields that are out there, or pepper fields, especially in the Chatham, Kent, Essex area, it may look flat. In a lot of cases, it really isn't. The sample that you see off to the left there is actually from a somewhat undulating field, which isn't a big surprise. You look at how these soils were laid down in this area, and a lot of this area was old beaches. So we've got undulating or gently undulating landscapes, and those landscapes made themselves prone to erosion, especially during early cultivation. They may be a bit more stable now in some cases no, because that field in particular is one that I know will blow any given spring, but you can see the color difference. There's 5 different soil samples there laid beside each other. That's one field that was growing tomatoes. We were looking at it in a project looking at soil health and location and connection with tomato production and yield. So some pretty big color differences there, big organic matter differences, and not surprisingly, I could show you the roots that match up with that, and it's significant differences too. Add to that, we can have a big difference in the depth of the A horizon. So the soil profile you see there is a berry and sandy loam. Again, a pretty common soil type for this area. And you can see that our AP, AH, that's all the topsoil or the A horizon. Usually you'll see a color change, and I'll show you a picture in a second that shows that a little bit better. We can see in some of the tomato fields, over the years, we've had land leveling. So in some places, those hilltops have been scraped off and leveled. And depending on the area, they may have been scraped off and leveled without maybe as much care as we would use now, as much understanding about topsoil as we have now. We can also get textural layers. I was just talking to a grower the other day about, again, a tomato field, lovely sandy loam, silt loam soil, but below it, there's a layer of gravel, and below that is a clay layer. That changes how the plant roots, how it grows, the potential for compaction, all those kinds of things. And as I said, there's tremendous differences in organic matter. These are all things a lot of this we can observe, we can see it. Okay, so there's lots of different ways of doing that looking. We can use an auger, use a basic soil probe, we can use a shovel. You can see here's two comparisons of a soil probe. And if you look, you can, well, you are looking. You can see these are from adjacent fields, and you can see that we've got some differences there. You can see the red show up at depth. We've got differences in color, depth of a horizon. When we start seeing that reddish showing up, that tells us that historically there is a fluctuating water level. So we've got reduction of iron. That's why it's showing red. And we can know that there's historically or naturally, there may be a bit of a drainage issue here, which may or may not be totally overcome by our tile drainage. So important stuff to know about those soils. And that suggests to me, in this case, when I look at those probes, it suggests to me that there's probably a clay layer or something else deeper down, similar to that barium, so that it's holding water up. Makes it a tremendously productive soil, but in a wet year like 2021, might expect to see a few more problems, might expect to see more compaction historically there too. Structure is another piece that's kind of important. We've got texture versus structure. So texture is sand, silt, and clay. Structure is how those particles are held together. These are some soils actually not from this county or not from this area, more up in the Stratford area, and it's more of a silty clay loam, although truthfully, up against the Thames River, we have a lot of silty clay loams. And if you ever end up in there are tomato fields that are silty clay loam too, can be tremendously productive. So we can see the difference in structure here. We've got more aggregation where we've got the rotation, a longer rotation and lower tillage, as opposed to the continuous corn with full tillage. We don't have that granular structure, and that plays a part in how well water moves, how well roots move. So there's a close-up. Now, compaction. This is one I want to really highlight because 2021 was a rough year. Whether you were in corn, soybeans, for that matter, any of the processing crops, it was a rough year for trying to get a crop off in decent shape. So we are going to see, unless we have the absolute perfect year, and it's not starting that way so far, you're going to see probably some compaction issues, especially if we turn hot and dry. Compaction is caused by weight and under moist conditions, and also just the number of trips over the field. So we often see compaction being set up in our horticultural crops. And while we think of it in terms of the heavier soils, sands are probably the worst because they will compact, and they'll compact tight at depth. And it's really hard to get that back open again. Whereas the heavier soils tend to have a better structure that will mellow over time. So with compaction, we see dense soils, less pore space, and restricted root systems. And that means when push comes to shove under dry conditions, we'll see drought response a lot sooner because there's less available water. And like I say in here, the kicker is the tillage is hidden it. So you have to look for patterns. And it's important to know a little bit more about what are the key things to look for. And it's usually the crop that's going to tell us. So we may see standing water, but we're more likely to see restricted root systems, whether they're flattened roots like this corn, or the bun at the bottom is actually from a tomato field in this county, where that field had just hit the wall. It had stopped growing. It was fairly early June, and it just stopped. We were getting on dry. When I went to dig it up, sure enough, we've got platiness happening there. We've got interference with the root system. Once we got a rain on it, because this was not an irrigated field, that field took off. But there was subtle compaction there that was definitely retarding the growth. So it's important to take the time to get comfortable with the root systems and what they really should look like. You've probably seen corn root systems. It makes sense. Take a look at the developing tomato roots, the developing pepper roots as the season goes along to know what is normal. So the one on the left, they're all tomato roots. The one on the left, you can still see the core where the plug was. And it's very common. In fact, I expect to see it, and we'll expect to see it even this year. You expect to see that main root, that tap root, starting to wrap itself around the plug, because they're probably going to end up being held for a bit. And they just tend to expand into that plug and get a little bit root bound. We should see somewhere between 2 to 5. They're not tap roots, but they're a thicker root coming out, pretty much looking like a rooftop coming out. And they should go pretty much not straight down, but on an angle, right? And then we should see a plethora, a huge amount of surface roots that are in that top 4 to 6 inches. Those heavier roots should go down to depth. This is what we see with transplant tomatoes. That's the kind of growth we should see. So when you look at the root on the left-hand side, you can still see the plug. You can see the root mass that's there. Compare that with the root mass that I see in the plants that I dug up on the right-hand side. We see a lot of roots. Well, still not that many roots, really. These are all hand washed. So I've lost a lot of the fine root hairs, but we just don't have the root mass that really supported much of a plant above it. We've got a fair bit of roots growing in that surface, but not a lot of those deep, real feeder roots. So this is why I'm saying it's important to get to know what a tomato plant roots should look like. And that does mean sacrificing a few and taking a look at them along the season, because then it's easier to tell when you've got a compaction problem. Now, when we're looking at soil sampling for diagnostics, everybody's got their own way of getting organized for it. I like to always have a cooler with me. It doesn't have to be a big one, because often it's not a lot of soil samples that you need to throw in there. And a probe, we need to be looking at the biosecurity part of it and cleaning that probe between fields. Some boxes, pens, and of course a bucket, and not a metal bucket. It needs to be a plastic bucket, or a bucket that's not going to contaminate the sample. And I always think about problem areas. I want to collect my samples from the good and the bad, sometimes on the edge in between. That gives me something for contrast. And looking at soil samples, there's usually about 3 different ones. We don't often do soil nitrate samples for tomatoes and peppers. But if you're concerned, that is one way of getting an idea of where the soil is at and its ability to give off nitrogen for that plant. Our basic soil fertility and pH sample, though, is taken to a depth of 15 centimeters or 6 inches. This is the basic sample. You just hold it at room temperature. The critical one, though, if you're trying to do some problem solving, probably is a nematode sample. So for plant parasitic nematodes and any others that are there, because don't forget, I know we tend to focus on plant parasitic. There's a lot more out there that are good guys. The key thing with this is it's also a 6-inch sample in the end, but there's a bit of proviso on that. And we need to keep it cool and not allow it to freeze, and also not allow it to get too hot. So with nematode samples, we're taking them to a depth, like I said, of about 6 inches. We're actually going a little bit deeper than that, because when you think about it, the nematodes are alive, unless we're trying to just get soybean cyst or sugar beet cyst nematode. If we're going for root lesion, the common ones that are causing us problems within the tomato and pepper crop, we're looking at nematodes that are live. They're swimming in the soil water in between the aggregates and in the pore space. So they have to be alive to be extracted. And that soil at the top of our soil profile has tended to be exposed to a lot of weather extremes. So if you think about even the last week to 10 days, we've had freezing temperatures, we've had fairly warm temperatures, we've had rain, we've had no rain. We have a tendency to get the extremes. So often the nematodes are not there. So if we want a sample that's really going to give us good information, we want to take it to a depth of about 7 to 8 inches. And we're going to take that top inch or two off and discard it and keep the bottom part. We need to handle it gently and cool it gently. So if it's a really hot day, don't throw it in with 5 ice packs. We want to throw it in, place it in the cooler with an ice pack or 2 and just cool it down slowly. And we want to get it to the lab as soon as possible, because again, got to keep those nematodes alive. And I think that should be it for me, Amanda.
Do we have any questions for Ann? I don't see any in the chat. I think you're off the hook, Ann. Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies. Normally we'd go outside and we'd take some soil samples and muck about. I'll see you
Yeah,
next year.
don't worry. Nothing has gone the way it was supposed to today. So
Okay, take care.
you too. Thank you, Ann.
Yep.
Okay, so just give me 1 second to upload to Jendra's newest presentation here. You are the last presenter, yeah. So just our last presentation coming up. I just need 1 second to upload it. He made some changes to make it better for you. Come on. Our computers are so slow sometimes. It drives me nuts. I'm just going to run it right off the USB if you're okay with that. Okay. Okay, 1 second. This is for you. Plug it in. Okay, so the pointer is not gonna advance the slides because I have to plug the microphone in. All right, so you'll have to advance here and here. And then if you need a pointer, there's the pointer.
Cool.
Okay, so you'll have to use this because we had to unplug the pointer, okay, for the microphone. Okay. Hopefully that doesn't come up too much.
Yeah. So, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Amanda, for having me here today.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Actually, it's my first presentation after COVID, in-person presentation after COVID. So, and I had a similar presentation yesterday, but that was virtual. And my name is Tejendra Chapagai. I am a soil fertility specialist in horticultural crops with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. That means basically I deal with soil fertility related issues in fruits and vegetables, right? As a soil fertility specialist. And the title of my presentation today is Symptoms of Nutrient Deficiencies and Tissue Sampling. And in this presentation, I would basically talk about the major symptoms of nutrient deficiencies in fruit, especially in tomato and pepper. And I would also talk about tissue sampling procedures in tomato and pepper so that you can diagnose the problem and correct them immediately if needed. Okay. But before my presentation, I want to ask a few questions. So this is just to get a sense of how many of you are already got familiar with plant tissue, plant nutrients and tissue sampling process in tomato and pepper. Okay. And there are okay.
You got it? And then here. I had to unplug that.
And there are 5 multiple choice questions. And you are required to pick one answer out of 4 options given to each question. Okay. Why this is not.
You have to unplug the pointer. You have to use the arrows on the computer. Yeah.
Okay. And the first question is, what are the primary nutrients for crop plants? And the option is 1, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. 2nd, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. 3rd, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. and 4, both 1 and 2. 1, 4, 1. Okay, 4, 1. Okay, that sounds great. So I will display the answer after my presentation. Okay. So this is the pre-presentation review questions only. And my second question is, which nutrient is an important part of chlorophyll? First is nitrogen, second is phosphorus, third is potassium, and the fourth one is boron. Okay, number one, all number one. That's great. So, and the third question is, blossom end rot in fruits and vegetables is mainly caused by number 1, potassium, number 2, calcium, number 3, boron, and number 4, zinc. 2. Wonderful. Okay. And the fourth question is, what is the most appropriate time for tissue sampling from field grown tomatoes? Number 1, planting, number 2, early bloom, number 3, fruiting, and number 4, after harvest. 2. Wonderful. Okay, that's great. And the last question is, which part is most appropriate as tissue sample from tomato and pepper? Number 1, root, number 2, leaf, number 3, petiole, and number 4, fruit. 3, 2. Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for your response. Okay. I'm glad that we have got some sense of plant tissue, essential plant nutrients and tissue sampling procedures. That's really cool. So before talking about the deficiency symptoms, I would like to spend few moments to talk about essential plant nutrients. And essential plant nutrients means those nutrients that are required for growth and reproduction in crop plants. And those plant nutrients are broadly categorized into 3 different groups. They are primary nutrients, secondary nutrients, and micronutrients. Primary nutrients are also called macronutrients. And the reason is that plant requires primary nutrients in the large amount. And there are 6 nutrients that fall into this category. They are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But out of these 6 nutrients, plants obtained carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from the air and water. So we don't need to worry about that. So we only provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium through external fertilizers or manures, because plant obtained these nitrogens from the soil. Okay. And the secondary micronutrients, plants require those nutrients, secondary micronutrients, in the moderate amount. And there are 3 nutrients that fall into this category. They are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And referring to the micronutrients, they are as equally important as primary and secondary nutrients, but they are required by the plant in the small amount. Okay. And the examples of micronutrients are boron, zinc, molybdenum, manganese, iron, copper, and chloride. So in this presentation today, I'm not going to talk about the role or functions of each of these nutrients. Instead, I'm going to talk about the symptoms when they are deficient in crop plants. And while we are talking about the symptoms, it is important to note that those symptoms can be confusing, because many plant nutrient deficiencies share the same or very similar symptoms. Also, they can be similar to symptoms of many plant diseases. For example, we can observe deficiency symptoms in different parts of the plants. And when we observe deficiency symptoms, first in younger leaves or growing points, that could be because of the deficiency of sulfur, iron, copper, or manganese. But when we observe deficiency symptoms, first in older leaves, That could be because of the deficiency of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, zinc, and molybdenum. And in the meantime, it is important to note that the deficiency symptoms of calcium and boron never appear on older leaves or older growth. And the second example is retarded growth of the plant. I mean, reduction in growth of the plant. And when this symptom is combined with leaf chlorosis, that could be because of the deficiency of nitrogen, sulfur, or copper. But when the plant growth is retarded without leaf chlorosis, that could be because of the deficiency of phosphorus. And the third example is yellowing. And when we observed yellowing of older leaves, that could be related to nitrogen deficiency. But when we observe yellowing of younger leaves, that could be because of the deficiency of sulfur. So in that case, the symptoms can be confusing, okay? And this image also shows that the deficiency symptoms of boron, calcium, sulfur, iron, manganese, and copper are first observed in younger leaves, while the deficiency symptoms of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, molybdenum, and zinc are first observed in older leaves. So now let me talk about the deficiency symptoms of major nutrients. That means primary nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And when the plant is deficient in nitrogen, we usually observe yellowing of older leaves, as we discussed already. We can also observe thinner stems and stunted growth of plant due to nitrogen deficiency. Because nitrogen is primarily responsible for greenness and leafy growth in vegetables, crops and vegetables, right? And nitrogen is also a main component of chlorophyll, and it plays important role in photosynthesis. But when the plant is deficient in phosphorus, we usually observe reddish or purplish lower leaves. We can also observe poor flowering and fruiting and premature fruit drop due to phosphorus deficiency. And in terms of the role of phosphorus, it is primarily responsible for better root growth and architecture in crop plants. And when the plant is deficient in potassium, we usually observe yellowing of tips and edges of the leaf. Okay, and the plants become susceptible to different stresses such as biotic and abiotic stresses. And you can also observe blotchy or uneven ripening in tomato due to potassium deficiency. So potassium is mainly responsible for fruit development and quality. And the difference between the deficiency symptoms of potassium and nitrogen is that when the plant is deficient in nitrogen, you usually observe yellowing starting from the tip of the leaves and it proceeds towards the base. Okay, but when the plant is deficient in potassium, we usually observe scorched or burned symptoms along the edge of the leaves, okay, along the margin of the leaves. That's the difference between potassium and nitrogen deficiency symptoms. Now let us talk about the deficiency symptoms of calcium. When the plant is deficient, I mean tomato and pepper is deficient in calcium, we usually observe blossom end rot of tomato and pepper. We can observe the symptoms in tomato, jalapeno pepper, bell pepper, and so on. And when the plant is deficient in magnesium, we observe yellow and white patches between green veins of leaves. We can also observe poor flowering and fruit quality due to magnesium deficiency. And when the plant is deficient in sulfur, we usually observe pale green. The younger leaves usually becomes pale because the sulfur does not mobilize from older to younger leaves. And we can also observe reduction growth in plants. And when the plant is deficient in boron, usually the symptoms are appeared on petiole. Petioles are brittle and break up suddenly. We can also observe usually the younger leaves, they remain small, the curled inwards and deformed. We can also observe chapped surface on fruits, hollowness or puffiness in tomato. But the hollowness or puffiness in tomato is also caused by severe environmental factors such as very high temperature or very low temperature. We can also observe dieback starting from terminal buds due to boron deficiency. And when the plant is deficient in zinc, we usually observe development of small leaves that we refer to as little leaf symptoms in tomato or pepper. So we can also observe yellowing of younger leaves between green veins, wilting, poor fruiting, and dieback symptoms due to zinc deficiency. And when the plant is deficient in molybdenum, we usually observe leaves turning yellow and pale between veins. We can also observe leaves becoming bluish green in color, and they do not open completely due to molybdenum deficiency. And when the plant is deficient in manganese, we usually observe yellowish gold to brownish spots on the leaves. We can also observe stunted growth of plants and delayed maturity in tomato and pepper due to manganese deficiency. And in case they are deficient in iron, we usually observe intervenal chlorosis due to iron deficiency. And we can also observe stunted growth of plants. And in copper deficiency, the younger leaves turn pale and wilting without yellowing. So leaves can develop brown spots. We can also observe dieback of plants starting from the leaf tip. We can also observe development of multiple buds from the plant. And we can also observe production of gum pockets in tomato and peppers due to copper deficiency. And now I would like to talk about the second component of my presentation, which is tissue sampling procedures in tomato and pepper. And tissue sampling is important in tomato and pepper because we need to identify if a specific nutrient is excessive, adequate, or deficient during a growing season, and to correct the deficiency immediately if required. Second, there are no accredited soil tests available for boron, copper, iron, or molybdenum. And information that we collect from tissue sampling and analysis would help manage these nutrients, especially micronutrients. But it is important to note that tissue sampling could be unreliable sometimes for evaluating nitrogen and zinc, especially due to timing of sampling and growth stage of the plants. So tissue sampling could be most useful when it is combined with soil sampling along with visual inspection of the crop or field condition. Okay. And this table shows tissue sampling procedures for tomato and pepper, including timing and plant parts to be sampled. And in tomato and pepper, the best time, the appropriate time for tissue sampling is early or first bloom stage. But you can sample anytime, 3 to 4 weeks after transplanting, and continue sampling every 7 to 14 days throughout the season in tomato and pepper. And the best part to be collected as a sample is petiole of young but most recently mature leaf. This is usually 3 to 4 petiole down from the top of the plant. So we usually harvest petiole of 4th leaf from tip as a sample. And after you collect samples, leaves, you should separate the petiole from the leaflet immediately. And we usually use those petiole for nitrate nitrogen, phosphate phosphorus, and potassium analysis. And the leaflets are used for secondary and micronutrient analysis. And it is important to take samples from at least 50 plants randomly from across the field because the lab needs at least 250 gram fresh weight sample for tissue analysis. Okay. And sometimes we do sampling for problem diagnosis that we refer to as diagnostic tissue sampling. And this is required when you observe specific issues or problems in your field, right? And in that case, the sample should be collected separately from normal growth and affected areas to compare healthy and affected areas. And you shouldn't combine the samples, dead plant samples with fresh samples. So we shouldn't collect dead plants as a sample. And this slide tells about some do's and don'ts that we need to consider before, during, or after tissue sampling. So let me talk about some do's first. And some do's include, we should collect enough sample materials. That means 50 leaves or petioles or 250 gram fresh weight samples for field grown vegetables, including tomatoes and pepper. Second, we should separate the petiole from the leaflet immediately to stop the mobilization or translocation of nutrients between these parts. And third, we should put samples into paper bags, label them, and send to the lab as soon as possible. Okay. And some don'ts include, we shouldn't collect chlorotic or dead tissue or tissue damaged by insect pest and disease as a sample. Second, we shouldn't collect plant tissue contaminated with soil, because when it is contaminated with soil, it always gives inaccurate results, incorrect results. And third one is, we shouldn't ship the samples in plastic bags because they will sweat and rot. So the take-home messages from my presentation today is, number one, symptoms can be confusing. So many plant nutrient deficiencies share the same or very similar symptoms. Also, they can be similar to symptoms of many plant disease, number one. Number two, a certain way to know if a plant or crop is suffering from a nutrient deficiency is to have a soil test. We can also conduct tissue sampling test for quick correction of deficiency during a growing season. Third, plant tissue analysis is most useful when it is combined with the soil test along with the visual inspection of the crop and soil conditions. And the last one, tissue sampling method differ with crop types. So it differs between tree fruits, vines, annual field crops, vegetable crops, and so on. So attention should be needed while sampling and handling of the tissue samples. Okay. And the second component of my presentation was basically developed from the third edition of OMAFRA's Soil Fertility Handbook. So this handbook, the PDF version of this handbook is full color and it is available for download for free on OMAFRA website. However, the hard copy is black and white, and you can get the hard copy for $20 plus tax and shipping from Service Ontario. Okay. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening to my presentation. So I would be happy to answer if you have any questions, or you can reach out to me using this email address. And before ending my presentation, I would like to request all of you to visit AgriSuite and soiltestmanager.ca, because these are the online decision-making tool developed by OMAFRA and our partners for soil fertility management in field crops and horticultural crops. Okay. And now I would like to go back to the first 5 questions. Okay, so it's a review, post presentation review of those questions. So let's start with the first one. So what are the primary nutrients for crop plants? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and both 1 and 2. Number 4, right? So there are 6 nutrients that fall into the category of primary nutrients. However, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens are available from the air and water. So we do not need to worry about them. We only care about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, right? They should be obtained from the soil. Second, which nutrient is important part of chlorophyll? Obviously, number 1, which is nitrogen, because nitrogen is primarily responsible for greenness and leafy growth in crop plant, and it is an important part of chlorophyll. That's why it plays an important role in photosynthesis process. Okay. And third, blossom end rot in fruits and vegetables is mainly caused by, obviously, calcium. That's the deficiency symptoms of calcium. And we can observe these symptoms in tomato, and pepper too. And fourth, what is the most appropriate time for tissue sampling from field-grown tomatoes? that is obviously early bloom stage. But as we discussed already, you can sample any time after that, right? At like 1 or 2 weeks interval as required. Or you can do diagnostic tissue sampling anytime when you observe any symptoms, deficiency symptoms or issues in your field. But when you do diagnostic tissue sampling, you should collect sample from the affected as well as healthy areas. And the last question is, which part is most appropriate as tissue sample from tomato and pepper? And the correct answer is number 3, which is petiole. Because petiole is considered as most reliable source of nutrients in crop plants compared to leaves. But as you discussed earlier, already, petiole is used for primary nutrient analysis, basically nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. However, for micronutrient analysis, we still use leaf as a sample. Okay, that's it from my side. Thank you so much. So I'm not gonna ask this question today.
Thanks, Tajendra. Do you have any questions for Tajendra about tissue sampling or nutrient deficiencies? Okay, let's just check the chat, make sure. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat to Tajendra. So thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate
Thanks
it.
so much.
Okay, so I'm just going to say a couple of things here. I'll take the microphone. Yep, I'll get that for you in a second. Whoop,
Oh, sorry.
thanks, that's okay. Okay, so thanks everybody. So I'm just gonna say a couple of things to wrap up here and then we can be on our way. I guess it's a good thing I told y'all we'd be here till 1 o'clock because it's 1 o'clock. So I'm gonna send out to everybody a link to the recording of the video so you can go back and review some of the things because I know it was a little bit hard to hear some of the stuff at times. So just give me some time to edit the video and cut out all of those gaps and then I'll be able to send that out. I'm also going to send you a link to a survey so you can give us some feedback on how things went today. I know it wasn't ideal and I do apologize for that, but be very honest. Your feedback on how these events went, both virtually and in person, are really important for us on how to make things better and more effective in the future. So we'll send that out. And then I'll also make sure to include the picture handouts that Darren sent out in person. I'll include those in the email as well. Somebody just left me their number. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. Okay, so that's it. I'll send all the materials and everything out through the email. Give me a couple of days. It'll be either tomorrow or Friday that you should be getting that email because I got to edit the video. Okay, so thank you again for everybody joining virtually and have a wonderful day.